I am Cassidy, 33 years old, and at my father's will reading, sitting in a stuffy law office with 8 relatives. My mother laughed in my face. "Your father left you nothing," she announced to the room, swirling her iced water like it was champagne. "He hated you for 20 years, Cassidy." Just then, the lawyer pulled out a sealed brown envelope stamped with my dead father's name, read the first line silently, and slid it across the mahogany table directly toward me. I sat completely still. My Uncle Mitchell, who had not spoken to me in 13 years, leaned forward and whispered, "Open it, but not in front of her." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family, while the golden child got everything. You are going to want to see exactly what was inside that brown envelope. "Give it here, Cassidy, my mother," Catherine demanded. She extended a manicured hand across the table, her diamond rings catching the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. "Your father died absolutely bankrupt. It is probably just his unpaid medical bills or some overdue property taxes. Pass it over so Terrence can handle it with the actual estate." "Mr. Caldwell, take that back from her," Catherine snapped, glaring at the attorney when I did not immediately move. Thomas was not in his right mind during his final months. He was heavily medicated. Whatever he scribbled down or signed in secret is invalid. I am the executor of the main estate. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked at my mother with polite exhaustion. "Mrs. Catherine, as I just stated, this envelope was entrusted to my firm 10 years ago, long before your husband's illness. It is a separate directive entirely outside the purview of the main will. I am legally obligated to hand it directly to Cassidy." I looked at my mother, then at the thick brown envelope resting under my fingertips. Without a single word, I picked it up and slid it smoothly into my black leather designer bag. Terrence let out a loud theatrical sigh from his plush leather chair. He was my sister's husband, a towering African-American venture capitalist who treated every family gathering like a hostile corporate takeover. "Oh, let her keep it," Catherine Terrence sneered, adjusting his custom silk tie with a smug grin. "She wants to be dramatic over a dead man's trash. Let her have her little moment. It is literally all she is walking away with today anyway. The rest of the estate belongs to us." My older sister Melanie smiled, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater. "She is just mad because Dad could not afford to pay for her college, but he paid for my med school." Melanie complained loudly, grabbing her designer coat and ensuring the lawyer heard every word. "We all know she has been bitter ever since Dad co-signed the loan for my private clinic instead of helping her with her first apartment. It is just sad at this point. Honestly, Cassidy, just open it so we can all have a good laugh and go to lunch. Terrence made reservations at that new steakhouse and you are holding us up." I did not flinch. I did not mention that I had worked 3 grueling jobs to pay my own tuition while my parents handed her hundreds of thousands of dollars for a medical degree. She abandoned the second she married Terrence. I simply stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit, and looked around the room at the people who were supposed to be my family. "We are done here," I said quietly to Mr. Caldwell. Terrence chuckled, a low, grating sound. "Listen to her play the tough girl. Look, Cassidy, we know you are struggling. Consulting is a tough gig when you do not have a real network. Melanie and I can write you a check for $500 to cover your flight back home. Just leave the envelope. If it is debt, you cannot afford it. If it is garbage, you do not need it." I stared at Terrence. He thought I was a struggling consultant, barely making ends meet. My family had always viewed my independence as a failure because I refused to beg them for help. They had no idea I ran a highly successful crisis management firm, stepping in as a turnaround CEO for failing corporations. They saw my simple, unbranded clothing and assumed poverty, not realizing true wealth does not need to scream its name. "Keep your money, Terrence," I replied. "You might need it for your own venture soon." His jaw tightened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his face before he masked it with that familiar, arrogant smirk. Melanie immediately jumped to her husband's defense. "You are so ungrateful, Cassidy. Terrence is offering you a handout, and you act like a brat. This is exactly why Dad cut you out. You never fit in with us. You never understood how to build a legacy." I glanced at Uncle Mitchell, who was quietly packing his briefcase. He gave me a barely perceptible nod toward the door. "Enjoy your legacy, Melanie," I said. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. As the heavy oak door swung shut behind me, I could hear Catherine's shrill voice complaining to the lawyer about my disrespectful attitude and demanding to see the contents of my father's safety deposit boxes. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt like an eternity. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing steady. I navigated through the dimly lit concrete structure until I reached my rental car. I slid into the driver's seat and immediately hit the lock button. The silence of the car wrapped around me. My hands, which had been perfectly steady in front of my family, now shook slightly as I reached into my bag and pulled out the sealed brown envelope. The paper was heavy, the edges worn, and my father's uneven handwriting spelled out my name in thick black ink. I tore the seal. I reached inside and my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a sleek black USB drive. It was heavy encrypted, the exact kind of hardware I usually saw when dealing with high-level corporate espionage. But that was not all. I reached back into the envelope and pulled out a single piece of heavy cardstock. It was an official legal document dense with tiny print and stamped with the state seal. I smoothed it out against the steering wheel and read the header. Deed of assignment. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, my brain struggling to process the legal jargon until I reached the bottom line. The implications hit me with the force of a freight train. A sharp gasp escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet car. Everything my family thought they knew, everything they thought they owned, was a complete lie. I grabbed my laptop from the passenger seat, flipping it open with shaking hands. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across the dark interior of my rental car. I gripped the heavy black USB drive. It felt cold against my palm. I shoved it into the port. A security prompt immediately flashed on the screen, demanding a decryption key. My mind raced. What would my father use? I tried his anniversary. Incorrect. I tried Melanie's birthday, the golden child. Incorrect. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. Of course not. I typed in the date of the only day he ever stood up to my mother, the day he drove me to the airport when I left for Chicago with nothing but 2 suitcases. The screen flashed green. Access granted. Folders cascaded across my desktop, hundreds of them. I clicked on the master file labeled the Phoenix Holding Group. Spreadsheets, legal charters, and banking routes flooded my vision. I was staring at a labyrinth of corporate shell companies and offshore accounts. The numbers at the bottom of the ledgers were staggering. Millions upon millions of dollars completely untraceable to the main estate my mother had just inherited. A violent knock on my driver's side window made me scream. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart hammering in my throat. Standing in the dim light of the parking garage was my Uncle Mitchell. He looked over his shoulder toward the elevator banks, his face tight with urgency. He knocked again, harder this time. I hesitated, then hit the unlock button. Mitchell did not go to the driver's side. He hurried around the front of the car, yanked open the passenger door, and threw himself into the seat. Before I could say a word, he slammed the door shut and instantly hit the master lock button. "Drive to the lower level," he ordered, his eyes darting around the concrete pillars. "Get us out of sight from the lobby doors." I threw the car into drive and spiraled down into the darkest corner of the underground garage, cutting the engine behind a massive cement column. I turned to him, clutching the deed of assignment against my chest. "What is going on, Mitchell? Why did you tell me to hide this?" Mitchell let out a long, ragged breath. He looked older than his 60 years, the lines around his mouth carved deep by family secrets. "Your father did not die broke, Cassidy. He died pretending to be broke to trap them." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. "Trap who?" "Mom." Mitchell scoffed, a bitter sound that echoed in the quiet car. "Catherine, Melanie, and that slick-talking fraud Terrence. Open the laptop, Cassidy. Look at the Phoenix Holding Group files. Look at the asset transfers from the last 24 months. I opened the laptop again. The blue light washed over Mitchell's grim face. I navigated to the folder he mentioned. Rows of massive wire transfers appeared, all siphoning money out of my parents' joint accounts and the family estate equity. Mitchell pointed a thick, calloused finger at the screen. 2 years ago, your father got sick. Catherine thought the medication made him weak. She thought his mind was slipping. So she and Terrence went to work. Terrence likes to parade around town as a high-rolling venture capitalist, but his flagship tech startup was hemorrhaging cash. He was millions in the red. Investors were threatening to sue him for fraud. Melanie was not helping. Your golden child sister was burning through $50,000 a month on luxury vacations, designer wardrobes, and keeping up appearances at the country club. My stomach churned. Melanie had just mocked me for being poor upstairs while she was secretly bankrupting her own husband. They needed cash fast. Mitchell continued, his voice dripping with disgust. So Catherine forged your father's signature on power of attorney documents. She secretly remortgaged the ancestral estate, the one she is living in right now, and funneled every single penny into Terrence's failing business to keep him out of federal prison. They sucked your father's visible estate completely dry. They thought they got away with it because they thought Richard was too sedated to notice the alerts from the bank. But he did notice, I whispered, staring at the staggering figures on the screen. Mitchell smiled, a cold, predatory expression that reminded me so much of my dad. Richard noticed everything. He played the fool. He let Catherine think she was the mastermind, but behind the scenes he reached out to me. We spent the last 2 years quietly liquidating his private assets, his stock options, his offshore accounts that Catherine knew nothing about. We moved all of it into a blind trust, the Phoenix Holding Group. He named it that for a reason, Cassidy. I looked down at the deed of assignment in my lap. The document named me as the sole owner and acting CEO of the trust. But why leave it to me? Why not just confront them? Because confronting them would have given them time to hide the money they stole, Mitchell said. Your father knew you were the only one in this family with the strategic mind to execute his final play. He knew you were not the struggling consultant Catherine thinks you are. He knew you built your own empire in Chicago. He needed a killer, Cassidy. He needed you. I looked back at the screen. The numbers were staggering, but something else caught my eye. The corporate structure of Phoenix Holding Group was not just a bank account. It was a lending firm. I clicked into the active accounts receivable ledger. Mitchell watched my face closely. Tap the screen. Cassidy, open the liability section of Terrence's corporate portfolio. I scrolled down, my pulse roaring in my ears. I opened the file marked Terrence Ventures, LLC. I scanned the list of their active corporate debt, the massive loans keeping his fake tech empire afloat, the mortgages tied to my mother's estate. I looked at the column listing the primary creditor. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, sure I was misreading the legal text. I traced my finger across the glowing screen, reading the name of the entity that held the paper on every single thing my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law owned. The primary creditor was the Phoenix Holding Group. I slowly turned to look at Mitchell. The silence in the car was deafening. He held my gaze, his eyes shining with a mixture of grief and fierce pride. They think they won today, Mitchell whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Catherine thinks she inherited a free and clear estate. Terrence thinks his debts are buried in anonymous corporate shell companies. They have no idea that the very ground they walk on, the walls they sleep inside, the cars they drive belong to the trust. I looked back at the screen, then down at the deed of assignment. The Phoenix Holding Group owned the mortgages. Phoenix Holding Group owned the business loans. And I owned Phoenix Holding Group. I did not just have my father's money. I had their entire financial existence resting in the palm of my hand. I owned them, body and soul. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I folded the deed of assignment back into the brown envelope and locked the USB drive securely in the hidden compartment of my bag. My father had played a magnificent game of chess from his deathbed, and now it was my turn to move the pieces. I started the engine of my rental car. and pulled out of the underground garage, leaving Uncle Mitchell to make his own way back. I had a funeral reception to attend. The drive to the family estate in the affluent Chicago suburbs took less than an hour. Pulling through the wrought iron gates, I looked at the sprawling stone mansion. For 20 years, this house had been a monument to my mother's vanity. The perfectly manicured hedges, the sweeping circular driveway, the imported marble fountains. It all projected an image of untouchable wealth. But as I parked behind a line of luxury vehicles, the grand estate looked completely different to me. It no longer looked like an intimidating fortress of old money. It looked like a very expensive piece of collateral, and the deed to it was currently resting against my ribcage. I walked up the wide stone steps and reached for the heavy brass door handle, but the door swung open before I could touch it. My mother stood blocking the entryway. Catherine wore a custom black mourning dress that looked more suited for a fashion runway than a wake. She held a crystal glass of sparkling water, her eyes sweeping over me with familiar disdain. The scent of expensive catered food and forced sympathy wafted out from the grand foyer behind her. "You can come in to eat, Cassidy," my mother said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the guests inside could not hear. "But do not think you are staying the weekend. I want you to go upstairs and pack up your old bedroom by tonight. I need your things out of this house." I paused on the threshold. My father was barely in the ground for 3 hours, and she was already erasing my physical footprint from the family home. "Why the sudden rush, Mother?" "Melanie and Terrence are moving their things in permanently," she replied, taking a delicate sip from her glass. "They are expanding the master suite, and your old room is going to be knocked through to create a walk-in closet for Melanie. It is long overdue. She needs the space for her new spring collection." The casual cruelty of her words washed over me, but the sting I used to feel was completely gone. I remembered being 15 years old when she took my private bathroom and converted it into storage for Melanie's beauty pageant gowns, telling me I should be grateful I even had a roof over my head. She had spent a lifetime making sure I knew I occupied the lowest rung on the family ladder. But standing there now, knowing I owned the very floorboards she was standing on, her arrogance was almost comical. I stepped past her, brushing my shoulder against hers, and walked into the crowded foyer. The reception was in full swing. Dozens of relatives and business associates murmured in hushed tones, holding plates of artisanal sandwiches and expensive cuts of meat. Before I could even reach the dining room, a tall figure stepped directly into my path. Terrence looked down at me, his tailored morning suit pulling tight across his broad shoulders. He held a leather-bound clipboard in one hand. He flashed a brilliant fake smile at a passing aunt, playing the role of the grieving, responsible son-in-law flawlessly. But the moment we were out of earshot, his expression hardened into a glare. "Glad you decided to show up, Cassidy," Terrence said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I was just talking to the caterer." He slapped the heavy clipboard directly against my chest, forcing me to grab it before it fell. I glanced down at the invoice attached to it. The total for the food and staff was exactly $4,000. "Since you did not get any inheritance today," Terrence continued, his voice loud enough for the nearest group of relatives to hear, "consider paying for the sandwiches your contribution to the family. It is the least you can do, considering Richard paid for your entire childhood. Melanie and I have taken care of the actual funeral costs, so do not say we never help you out." He crossed his arms, staring down at me with absolute certainty. He expected me to flush with embarrassment. He expected me to stammer about not having the funds to beg my mother for a pass in front of her high society friends. He wanted to humiliate me to assert his dominance as the new patriarch of the family now that my father was gone. He wanted everyone to see the struggling outcast daughter failing to pull her weight. I looked at the invoice, then looked back up at Terrence. I did not blink. I did not argue. I reached into my designer bag, sliding my hand right past the brown envelope that held the ruin of his entire life, and pulled out my wallet. I extracted a heavy matte black metal card. The Centurion card. The invitation-only American Express that required millions in annual spending just to maintain. I signaled the head caterer, who was hovering nervously near the kitchen door. He hurried over, eyes darting between me and Terrence. "Run it," I said, handing the metal card to the caterer. Put a 20% tip on there for your staff. They have done a wonderful job today. The caterer took the heavy card, his eyes widening as he recognized what it was and practically sprinted away to process the payment. Terrence stared at my hand, then at the retreating caterer. The smug satisfaction wiped completely off his face. He blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he had just seen. "That is a dangerous game, Cassidy," he finally muttered, leaning in close so only I could hear. "Maxing out credit cards to save face at a funeral. You are going to be paying off those sandwiches for the next 5 years. You do not have that kind of capital." I slipped my wallet back into my bag and stepped closer to him. The music in the background seemed to fade away. The chatter of the guests became white noise. I looked him dead in the eye, dropping my voice to a sharp, icy whisper. "I have plenty of capital, Terrence, enough to buy and sell you 10 times over." I patted his arm, feeling the rigid tension in his muscles. "Enjoy the master suite expansion. You and Melanie deserve a nice big bedroom. Just make sure your property taxes are up to date." Terrence froze. The color drained from his face, leaving an ashen, sickly hue behind. His confident posture crumpled instantly. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He knew exactly what I meant. A man swimming in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt knows the exact status of his property taxes, and he knows that only the entity holding his loans would dare bring them up in casual conversation. I smiled warmly at him, turned my back and walked toward the dining room to get a sandwich, leaving the new patriarch of the family suffocating in absolute terror. By Monday morning, the heavy scent of funeral lilies and the suffocating tension of my mother's estate were miles behind me. I stepped out of the private elevator and onto the top floor of the glittering glass high-rise that housed my crisis management firm in downtown Chicago. My family spent the last decade believing I was a struggling low-level consultant, scraping by on petty contracts. They pictured me working out of a cramped apartment, drowning in debt, forever jealous of Melanie and her successful venture capitalist husband. The reality was a stark contrast to their delusions. I was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most ruthless turnaround firms in the Midwest. When massive corporations faced bankruptcy, hostile takeovers, or federal collapse, they called me to stop the bleeding. I commanded a team of 60 ruthless analysts and attorneys. I did not beg for a seat at the table. I owned the building. My executive assistant, Sarah, was waiting for me the second I walked through the double-glass doors. She matched my brisk pace as we walked down the sprawling corridor toward my corner office, handing me a freshly pressed espresso and a sleek silver tablet. "Welcome back, Cassidy," Sarah said, her voice strictly professional. "I am sorry for your loss. We handled the merger protocols while you were away, but there is an urgent flag on your personal portfolio. The Phoenix Holding Group accounts triggered an automated alert at 6 this morning." I stopped walking. The Phoenix Holding Group. The blind trust my father had secretly built and left entirely in my control. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my office, set my coffee on the massive marble desk, and took the tablet from Sarah. "Show me the alert," I instructed, sinking into my leather chair. Sarah tapped the screen, bringing up a complex financial ledger that projected directly onto the large, smart monitor mounted on my office wall. The numbers glowed in harsh red against the dark background. "It is Vanguard Tech Solutions," Sarah explained, pulling up the corporate profile. "The venture capital firm owned by your brother-in-law, Terrence. They hold a massive line of credit through Phoenix Holding Group secured against his business assets and your mother's primary residence. They just missed their monthly premium. And it is not just a late payment, Cassidy. Their corporate accounts are showing insufficient funds across the board. They are completely tapped out." I stared at the glowing red numbers on the screen. Terrence had stood in the foyer of my mother's house just 2 days ago, dripping with arrogance, mocking me for being poor. He had handed me a catering bill like I was a peasant begging for scraps, completely unaware that his own empire was running on fumes. Now the mask was slipping. "Pull up their raw transaction history for the last 90 days, I ordered, leaning closer to the screen. "I want to see exactly where the capital from our loans went." Terrence claimed he needed this money for server expansion and tech acquisition, Find the leak. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard. Within seconds, a new spreadsheet populated the monitor. It was a detailed breakdown of Vanguard Tech Solutions' outgoing wire transfers. I scanned the lines of data, my eyes narrowing as a glaring pattern emerged. The money was not going towards servers' payroll or tech acquisitions. The capital was bleeding out through a series of exorbitant consulting fees paid weekly to a third-party vendor. "Click on that vendor," I said, pointing at the screen. "Who owns that shell company?" Sarah ran the tax identification number through our database. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "It is registered to a Melanie Vanguard." A cold, humorless laugh escaped my throat. My sister. Melanie was supposedly the supportive, wealthy wife of a tech genius living a life of pure luxury. In reality, she was siphoning cash out of her husband's failing business to fund her own lifestyle. "Look at the itemized expenditures from her account," Sarah said, reading off the screen with a tone of utter disbelief. $50,000 wired to a luxury car dealership in Beverly Hills, $30,000 to a boutique designer in Paris, $15,000 spent at a private resort in the Maldives just last week. She is pulling capital directly from the business loans to fund personal shopping sprees. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the list of designer bags, luxury cars, and five-star vacations. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking, but it was not surprising. It triggered a memory so vivid, I could almost feel the phantom sting of it. I was 12 years old, saving every penny of my chore money in a small tin box hidden under my bed. I wanted to buy a second-hand laptop to learn coding. I had saved for 10 months. One afternoon, I came home from school to find the box empty. Melanie had taken the money to buy a designer prom dress. When I cried and begged our mother to make Melanie give it back, Catherine had simply rolled her eyes. "Melanie needs to look presentable for her social circles," Catherine had told me, brushing my tears away with cold annoyance. "You do not go to parties, Cassidy. You do not need the money. Let your sister shine." I looked at Sarah, my voice dropping to a harsh, steady cadence. "She is still stealing my allowance, Sarah. Only now the tin box under the bed is a multi-million-dollar corporate loan, and she is too stupid to realize she is spending my money again." Terrence was not just failing as a businessman. He was a coward, letting his spoiled wife cannibalize his company because he was too terrified to tell her they were actually broke. They had mortgaged my mother's house, the very roof over her head, just so Melanie could keep up appearances at the country club. The entire Golden Child empire was built on a foundation of rotting wood and stolen cash. And now I held the match. "Get Mr. Gallagher on the line," I commanded, referring to my ruthless head of legal. Sarah dialed the number and put the call on speakerphone. Gallagher answered immediately. "Good morning, Cassidy. What is the target today?" I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the bustling Chicago streets below. "I need you to draft a formal notice of default, Gallagher. Target is Vanguard Tech Solutions, owned by Terrence Vanguard. They have breached the terms of their master loan agreement with Phoenix Holding Group." "On what grounds are we accelerating the debt?" Gallagher asked, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. "Gross financial mismanagement, fraudulent allocation of funds, and breach of fiduciary duty," I replied smoothly. "He took our capital under the guise of business expansion and funneled it into his wife's personal luxury accounts. I want the notice of default drafted immediately. I want it hand-delivered by a process server directly to Terrence's glass-walled office so his entire staff can see it happen." "Understood," Gallagher said. "What is the cure window?" 48 hours, I said, my voice as hard as steel. "Give him exactly 48 hours to produce $2 million in liquid cash to bring the accounts current. If the money is not wired into the Phoenix Holding Group accounts, the second the deadline expires, we initiate immediate asset seizure." "And the primary collateral?" Gallagher asked. I smiled, thinking of my mother bragging about expanding her master suite. "The primary collateral is Catherine's estate. If Terrence cannot pay the $2 million, we foreclose on my mother's house. Execute the order." The line went dead. I set the phone face down on the cool marble surface of my desk. The sheer weight of what I had just set into motion settled over me, not as a burden, but as an armor I had spent my entire adult life forging. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, The Chicago skyline stretched out in a jagged horizon of glass and steel, completely indifferent to the financial execution I had just authorized. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the low, steady hum of the climate control system. Then the silence shattered. My personal cell phone resting next to my keyboard began to vibrate violently against the desk. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of notifications. It was the family group chat, a thread I had kept muted for the better part of a decade. I only ever checked it out of morbid curiosity or to confirm the dates of mandatory holiday dinners I planned to avoid. Today, however, the digital barrage was impossible to ignore. I picked up the device. The messages were flooding in so fast the screen struggled to keep up. My mother was leading the charge, her digital voice carrying the same shrill, demanding tone she used in person. Terrence's business is under attack by some predatory lending firm. We need to pool our resources. Catherine had typed her message punctuated by blaring red alert emojis. I read the words twice, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. Predatory lending firm. Terrence had clearly sprinted home in a blind panic after the process server handed him the notice of default. He must have spun a frantic tale for my mother and Melanie, painting himself as the innocent victim of a ruthless corporate shark. He likely had not even realized yet who owned Phoenix Holding Group, or he was too terrified to admit to his wife and mother-in-law that the quiet, dismissed sister held the keys to their destruction. He was playing for time, begging for cash to plug a hole in a sinking ship. My phone buzzed again. Catherine had sent another block of text, this one aimed directly at me. Take out a loan against your 401k to help your brother-in-law. It's what family does. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand left me momentarily speechless. For years, Catherine had refused to co-sign a simple student loan for my undergraduate degree, citing her need to maintain her own financial flexibility. I had worked night shifts scrubbing floors in a commercial bakery to pay my tuition. Yet now, without a second thought, she demanded I gut my own retirement savings to bail out a man who had mocked my supposed poverty just 48 hours earlier. She assumed I was a mid-level corporate drone, clinging to a meager 401k, and she viewed that imaginary safety net as rightfully hers to commandeer. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear as Melanie joined the chat, undoubtedly preparing to add her own layer of guilt and pressure. I did not wait for her message to land. I placed my thumbs over the keyboard and typed my response with deliberate surgical precision. I don't invest in sinking ships. I hit send. The group chat went dead. The rapid-fire typing bubbles vanished instantly. I could almost picture the scene in my mother's lavish living room. The stunned silence, the exchanging of outraged glances, the collective shock that the family scapegoat had dared to defy a direct order. 10 seconds later, my phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Melanie's name. I swiped to accept the call and brought the phone to my ear, not saying a word. "You jealous, bitter spinster!" Melanie shrieked, her voice so loud I had to pull the phone an inch away from my head. "Who do you think you are talking to? Mom is in tears right now because of your selfish, disgusting attitude." I remained silent, letting her rage burn through the cellular connection. "You have always wanted to see us fail." Melanie spat, her breathing heavy and erratic. "You have always been obsessed with my life because yours is so pathetic. You sit in your tiny apartment in Chicago entirely alone, seething with envy because I have a successful husband and a beautiful home. You could not land a man like Terrence if you tried, so you want to watch him lose his company. You are a spiteful, lonely little girl." Her insults were a familiar script, a greatest hits compilation of every insecurity she had tried to project onto me since we were teenagers. She used to stand in the doorway of my bedroom, holding her designer shopping bags, mocking my discount store clothes, telling me I would never amount to anything more than a background character in her glamorous life. "Are you quite finished, Melanie?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not use that tone with me," she snapped. "Terrence is a genius. This is just a temporary cash flow issue caused by aggressive market fluctuations. He is going to bounce back from this predatory attack, and when he does, you will be cut out of this family forever. Do not ever ask us for a dime." I walked back to my desk, running my hand along the edge of the polished marble. A genius doesn't leverage his mother-in-law's house to buy his wife designer bags, Melanie. The line went dead silent. Only the faint sound of her ragged breathing echoed through the speaker. "What did you just say?" She whispered, the venom in her voice suddenly replaced by a sharp, paralyzing fear. "I know about the shell company, Melanie." I continued, my words dropping like stones into a glass bowl. "I know about the $50,000 you wired to the Beverly Hills dealership. I know about the $30,000 you blew in Paris last month. You have been bleeding your husband's company dry to fund your shopping addiction, using capital secured by the roof over your mother's head. You did not just bankrupt your husband, you bankrupted your mother." "Cassidy, how do you?" Melanie stammered, her voice cracking. "How could you possibly know about—" I calmly hung up on Melanie, cutting off her panicked question mid-sentence. I did not need to hear her excuses. I did not need to listen to her beg. The time for talking had expired the moment my father signed that deed of assignment. I placed my cell phone back on the desk and reached for the multi-line corporate console. I pressed a button on my desk phone connecting directly to my legal department. Mr. Gallagher picked up on the first ring. "Yes, Cassidy." I looked out at the city skyline, feeling the raw, undeniable power of absolute control. "Freeze their corporate credit lines," I ordered, "now." It took exactly 3 days for their absolute desperation to manifest into a public spectacle. Cut off from their corporate credit lines and bleeding cash by the hour, Terrence and Melanie did what cornered grifters always do. They threw a party. The invitations called it the Vanguard Innovation Gala, held at the most exclusive ballroom in downtown Chicago. It was a lavish, over-the-top charity event designed specifically to project a flawless illusion of untouchable wealth and philanthropic grace. The strategy was brutally transparent to anyone who knew how to read a balance sheet. They needed to dazzle new, unsuspecting angel investors and trap them into injecting fresh capital into the sinking ship of Vanguard Tech Solutions before my notice of default became public knowledge. They were trying to outrun a financial avalanche while wearing designer shoes. I decided to attend. I was not going to sit in my penthouse and wait for the legal clock to expire. I wanted a front-row seat to their desperate performance. And more importantly, I wanted them to know exactly who was pulling the strings. I bypassed my usual understated, invisible business attire. For this night, I required armor. I stepped into a custom-tailored crimson silk gown that cost a cool $10,000. The fabric flowed around me like liquid fire, an unapologetic declaration of power. I paired it with diamond drop earrings I had purchased for myself after closing my first major corporate acquisition. My hair was styled in a sleek, immaculate blowout, and my makeup was sharp enough to cut glass. When my private driver pulled up to the velvet rope outside the ballroom, I did not just step out of the car, I descended upon the event. The ballroom was a masterpiece of financial delusion. Towering ice sculptures carved into corporate logos dominated the center of the room. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of vintage champagne and caviar. A string quartet played softly from a raised balcony. It was a staggering waste of capital for a company that could not even make its loan payments, but desperation breeds extravagance. I glided through the gilded doors, immediately commanding the attention of the room. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd of high society elites and wealthy venture capitalists. They did not recognize me as the pathetic, struggling sister of the Vanguard family. They saw a woman radiating absolute authority and unbothered wealth. From across the room, I spotted my targets. Terrence was cornering a group of elderly, wealthy investors near the charity auction tables. Even from a distance, I could see the sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead. His usual smooth, booming laugh sounded strained and erratic as he practically begged them to look at his new prospectus. A few feet away, Melanie stood near the champagne tower. Her smile was completely brittle, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was clutching her crystal flute so tightly, I expected the glass to shatter in her hand. Her perfect world was collapsing, and the strain was cracking her porcelain facade. Then I saw my mother. Catherine was patrolling the perimeter of the ballroom like a deeply insecure guard dog. She was scanning the crowd, ensuring the illusion of her family's superiority remained absolute and unchallenged. Her eyes swept over the entrance, glossed past me for a fraction of a second, and then snapped back with violent whiplash. I watched the color drain completely out of her face. For a moment, her brain seemed to short-circuit. She looked at the $10,000 crimson gown, the diamonds, the unapologetic posture of the daughter she had spent 33 years trying to crush into dust. Her shock quickly morphed into a familiar venomous rage. Catherine immediately flagged down two burly security guards stationed near the coat check. She pointed a sharp, trembling finger directly at me and began marching across the polished marble floor, the guards trailing closely behind her like obedient attack dogs. I did not move. I simply stood near a massive floral arrangement, took a slow sip of my sparkling water, and waited for the collision. "What are you doing here?" Catherine hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper as she reached me. She positioned her body to block me from the view of the wealthy donors nearby. "I am just enjoying the ambiance, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level and calm. "The ice sculptures are a lovely touch for a company currently freezing to death." Catherine's eyes blazed with a frantic, unhinged fury. She signaled the two security guards to step closer, boxing me in against the floral display. "You are leaving right now," she commanded, her jaw tight with suppressed rage. "I will not let you do this. You always try to ruin your sister's big moments, just like you ruined her sweet 16. The sheer absurdity of the accusation hung in the air between us. It was her favorite historical grievance, a perfect encapsulation of her toxic parenting. I had been rushed to the emergency room with a ruptured appendix on the night of Melanie's sweet 16 party. My mother had spent the next 15 years telling everyone that my near-fatal medical emergency was just a calculated, selfish stunt to draw attention away from Melanie's custom ice sculpture. In Catherine's twisted reality, my pain was always an inconvenience to her golden child's glory. "I am not a sick teenager anymore, Mother," I said smoothly, shifting my weight and looking down at her. "And you do not get to dictate where I stand." Catherine turned to the security guards, her voice trembling with aggressive authority. "Grab her arms and escort her out the service elevator immediately. She is a trespasser. She is trying to disrupt a private charity event. Get her out of my sight." The two massive guards stepped forward, raising their hands to grab my shoulders. I did not flinch. I did not step back. "Wait, stop right there!" A panicked voice echoed over the music. A woman in a sharp tuxedo suit holding a clipboard sprinted across the marble floor, waving her arms frantically. It was the chief event organizer, her face pale with absolute terror, as she threw herself between me and the security guards. "Stand down immediately." The organizer ordered, the guards physically pushing their arms away from me. Catherine gasped in outrage. "Excuse me, I am the mother of the host. I gave you a direct order to remove this woman. She is not on the guest list." The event organizer turned to my mother, clutching her clipboard to her chest, her breathing heavy from sprinting across the ballroom. "Ma'am, you can't throw her out," the organizer said, her voice shaking with absolute certainty. "Ms. Cassidy is our platinum sponsor tonight. She funded this entire event." The mother's jaw drops. Catherine stood paralyzed. The muscles in her face went completely slack, her perfectly contoured expression melting into a mask of absolute, uncomprehending horror. The two massive security guards immediately dropped their hands and took a synchronized step backward, suddenly looking anywhere but at me. The event organizer stood trembling between us, her clipboard pressed against her chest, as if it could shield her from the radioactive tension radiating from my mother. For 33 years, Catherine had controlled the narrative. She had written the script where Melanie was the radiant star, and I was the unfortunate, embarrassing understudy. Hearing a stranger confirm that I was the financial architect of this entire lavish charade shattered her reality into pieces too small to glue back together. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy sound emerged. She looked at my diamonds, then at my gown, and finally at my eyes, searching for the struggling girl she had mocked. She found nothing but a predator looking back at her. "I suggest you return to the champagne tower, Mother." I said, my voice smooth and carrying effortlessly over the classical music playing from the balcony. You look like you need a drink. And please do try the caviar. I paid a premium for it. Catherine took a shaky, involuntary step backward, retreating from me as if I had suddenly caught fire. She turned on her heel and practically fled toward the far side of the ballroom, nearly colliding with a waiter in her blind panic. The brief commotion had not gone unnoticed. From across the room, Terence had watched the exchange. He saw Catherine, his fiercely protective mother-in-law, retreat in visible defeat. He handed his half-empty glass to a passing waiter and began marching toward me, his heavy footsteps eating up the polished marble floor. Terence was a man who relied on physical intimidation. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the aggressive, entitled swagger of a man who believed the world owed him its undivided attention. As he closed the distance between us, I could see the rigid tension in his jaw and the frantic darting movement of his eyes. He stopped just inches away from me, deliberately invading my personal space, trying to force me to step back and cede dominance. I planted my heels into the marble and held my ground, tilting my chin up to meet his glare. "I don't know who you're sleeping with to get this kind of money, but stay out of my business," Terence sneered, his voice dropping an octave into a harsh, threatening growl. He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sour metallic scent of his nervous sweat. "You think showing up in a rented dress and throwing some cash at a charity event makes you a player? You are out of your depth, Cassidy. This is the major leagues. You are messing with corporate infrastructure you cannot possibly understand. Back off, or I will personally make sure you never work in this city again." His attempt at intimidation was so textbook it was almost boring. He was repeating the exact same aggressive posturing he had used at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when he stood over the dinner table and loudly advised me to quit my silly consulting hobby and get a real job answering phones. He was still playing the role of the wealthy tech genius, putting the poor sister in her place. He had absolutely no idea that I held his financial autopsy in the palm of my hand. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I maintained a cool, detached smile as I slowly unclasped my sleek metallic clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper, neatly folded in thirds. "I understand corporate infrastructure perfectly, Terence," I said, my tone conversational as if we were discussing the weather. "For instance, I understand the mechanics of Series B funding rounds. I also understand exactly what happens when a founder lies to secure that capital." I unfolded the document with a sharp snap and held it up just high enough for his eyes to focus on the bold red figures printed across the page. It was a synthesized internal audit of Vanguard Tech Solutions extracted by my crisis management team earlier that afternoon. "You inflated your user numbers by 300% to secure your last round of funding, Terence. That's wire fraud." I kept my voice pitched low, forcing him to strain to hear the words that were destroying his life. "You fabricated ghost accounts. You routed investor capital through offshore shell entities to artificially pump your daily active user metrics. You lied to the banks, you lied to your board, and you used the resulting fraudulent capital to secure the loan from my firm." I watched his eyes track the numbers on the page. His pupils dilated. The aggressive alpha male posture completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped, and the color drained from his face so rapidly he looked as though he might pass out right there on the ballroom floor. The arrogant tech CEO vanished, replaced by a terrified man staring at a prison sentence. "You do not just owe my firm $2 million by tomorrow morning," I continued, stepping into the space he had just retreated from. "You have defrauded federal banks across state lines to fund your wife's shopping addiction. Give me that," Terence hissed, snatching the paper from my hand with trembling fingers. He scanned the document frantically, his breathing turning into shallow, ragged gasps. "This is illegal. You cannot have this. These are protected internal metrics. How did you get this?" "When you default on a master loan agreement, the holding company gains immediate unrestricted access to all internal ledgers," I explained smoothly. "You signed the authorization yourself, Terence. You were just too arrogant to read the fine print." He crumpled the paper in his fist, his head swiveling erratically as he looked around the crowded, glittering room. The string quartet was still playing a lively Vivaldi piece. The wealthy guests were still laughing and sipping my champagne. No one had noticed that the host of the gala was actively hyperventilating. He looked like a trapped animal searching for an exit that did not exist. Mr. Terrence. The voice came from directly behind him, calm, authoritative, and completely devoid of warmth. Terrence spun around, dropping the crumpled paper onto the marble floor. Two men in dark, unwrinkled suits had materialized from the crowd. They did not have drinks in their hands. They were not smiling. They moved with the synchronized, deliberate purpose of federal agents who had already locked down the perimeter. The taller of the two men reached into his jacket pocket and casually flipped open a leather badge wallet, flashing a gold shield under the crystal chandeliers. "Mr. Terrence." The man repeated his tone perfectly flat. "We're from the SEC. We'd like a word." The champagne glass slipped from Terrence's hand, shattering against the marble floor. The sharp crack cut through the soft music of the string quartet, drawing the eyes of the surrounding high society guests. Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely abandoned him. He looked at the two federal agents, then at the gold shield, and finally back at me. His arrogant swagger had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. "Is there a private room where we can conduct this conversation, Mr. Terrence?" the second agent asked, stepping seamlessly to his left to block any potential exit. "Or would you prefer to discuss your inflated user metrics and offshore wire transfers right here in front of your prospective investors?" Terrence swallowed hard, his face glistening with a cold sweat. He gave a jerky, defeated nod and allowed the agents to flank him. As they escorted him away from the auction tables and out of the glittering ballroom, a shockwave of whispers rippled through the crowd. The wealthy donors who had been eager to write him checks just moments ago were now backing away as if he were contagious. Melanie let out a piercing, hysterical shriek from across the room, abandoning her champagne to chase after her husband and the federal agents. I stood my ground, my crimson silk gown catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. I smoothed an invisible crease from my dress and locked eyes with my mother. Catherine was frozen near the floral arrangement, her chest heaving. The realization of what I had done washed over her face. I had not just ruined their party. I had dismantled their entire fraudulent empire in under 5 minutes. I gave her a slow, cold smile, turned on my heel, and walked out the grand double doors. By Tuesday morning, the fallout was absolute. I sat behind my massive marble desk at the crisis management firm reviewing the final asset seizure documents for Vanguard Tech Solutions. The company was in freefall, and Terrence was drowning in federal legal fees. I expected Catherine to surrender. I expected her to realize she was outmatched and beg for a quiet settlement. I vastly underestimated my mother's capacity for venom. My private office line rang. I ignored it, focused on a corporate merger file. Then my personal cell phone buzzed. Then the office line rang again. Sarah walked into my office, her usual brisk, professional demeanor replaced by a look of deep concern. "Cassidy," Sarah said, gripping her silver tablet. "Your Aunt Patricia just called the main reception line." She was practically in tears. "And then your cousin Gregory called. They both asked if we had staged an intervention yet." I set my pen down, my eyes narrowing. "An intervention for what exactly?" Sarah hesitated. "For your mental health." I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Play the voicemails," I ordered. Sarah tapped her screen. Aunt Patricia's frantic voice filled the room. "Sarah, please tell me Cassidy is safe. Catherine just called me weeping. She said Cassidy is having a severe psychotic break from the grief of losing her father. Catherine said Cassidy crashed Melanie's charity event screaming about imaginary bank fraud and had innocent people harassed. Catherine is terrified Cassidy might hurt herself or someone else. We need to get her committed to a psychiatric facility before she completely loses her mind." I stared at the glowing skyline outside my window. Catherine was not retreating. She was weaponizing my father's recent death to build a narrative of insanity. Instead of admitting her son-in-law was a federal criminal and she was a parasite, she was painting me as a hysterical, grieving spinster who had lost touch with reality. She was calling every extended family member and every high society contact in Chicago, spinning a web of lies to discredit the very source of their financial ruin. If I was insane, then my foreclosure on her estate and my exposure of Terrence were just the malicious, confused actions of a madwoman. My personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID showed Uncle Mitchell, my father's older brother. He was the only person in the family who had ever seen through Catherine's flawless socialite facade. I picked up the phone. "Good morning, Uncle Mitchell," I said smoothly. "I assume you have spoken to my mother today." "Cassidy, you need to listen to me very carefully," Uncle Mitchell said, his voice grave and urgent. "I know exactly what Catherine is doing, and you cannot underestimate her. She has spent the last 4 hours calling every single person in our family directory. She is telling them you are having a mental breakdown. She is telling them you are hallucinating financial crimes and attacking Melanie out of unhinged jealousy." "I know," I replied, my voice hard. "She is trying to invalidate the foreclosure by destroying my credibility." "It is worse than that," Uncle Mitchell warned, his tone dropping to a harsh whisper. "She is laying the groundwork to have you declared legally incompetent. If she succeeds, she can seize control of the Phoenix Holding Group Trust as your conservator. Do not brush this off, Cassidy. She did the exact same thing to your father when he tried to stop her gambling habits 10 years ago. She isolated him." The words hit me like a physical strike. 10 years ago, my father had briefly threatened to cut off Catherine's access to their primary accounts. Suddenly, rumors had swirled through our family that my father was suffering from early-onset dementia. Friends stopped visiting. Relatives stopped calling him for financial advice. Catherine had successfully quarantined him, crushing his resistance by making everyone believe his mind was failing. Now she was dusting off her favorite psychological weapon and aiming it directly at me. "I am not my father, Mitchell," I said, my grip tightening on the phone. "I own my narrative and I own the evidence. Let her talk. Her rumors cannot stop a federal indictment." "Just watch your back, Cassidy," he replied heavily. "She will not stop with the family. She will go after your livelihood next." I ended the call, my mind calculating the legal counteroffensive. I needed Gallagher to draft a cease and desist order for defamation immediately. I reached for my desk phone, but Sarah suddenly burst back through the heavy oak doors. She did not bother knocking. Her face was entirely drained of color. "Cassidy, we have a massive problem," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she rushed to my desk. She placed a printed email directly over the merger file I had been reviewing. It was a message from the board of directors at Sterling Global, our largest and most lucrative client. We were in the middle of negotiating a $30 million corporate turnaround contract with them. It was the crown jewel of my firm's portfolio. I scanned the heavy black text. "Dear Ms. Cassidy, effective immediately, Sterling Global is pausing all current negotiations and withdrawing our letter of intent regarding your firm's crisis management services. We have recently been made aware of highly concerning rumors regarding your current mental stability and erratic personal behavior. Given the sensitive nature of our corporate restructuring, we cannot entrust our financial future to an executive experiencing a documented psychological crisis." I stared at the printed words, the reality of the sabotage settling into my bones. Catherine was not just throwing a tantrum. She was calling my corporate partners. She was actively reaching into the highest echelons of the Chicago business world, using her country club connections to poison my professional reputation. My mother was trying to destroy my multi-million-dollar career to protect her stolen wealth. "Get Gallagher in here," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm. "We are going to war." Gallagher materialized in my office within 60 seconds, a leather folio already in hand. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I handed him the printed email from Sterling Global. He scanned it, his jaw tightening. Catherine was not just throwing a tantrum. She was executing a calculated smear campaign, leveraging her country club gossip network to poison my professional standing. I instructed Gallagher to draft a cease and desist order so aggressively worded it would make Catherine's country club lawyers choke. But paper shields were not enough. I needed to control the narrative directly. I told Sarah to schedule an emergency video conference with the Sterling Global Board of Directors for noon. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a pristine, undeniable dossier. It included Terrence's fraudulent financial statements, the official SEC filing against Vanguard Tech Solutions, and the master loan agreement bearing my signature as the chief executive officer of Phoenix Holding Group. I was not going to defend my mental health. I was going to prove my ruthless competency. At noon, the massive screen in my boardroom flickered to life. 7 grim-faced Sterling Global executives stared back at me. They expected a hysterical, unstable woman. Instead, I gave them a masterclass in crisis management. I laid out the facts methodically. I explained that the rumors were a desperate retaliation from a defaulting debtor who happened to be related to me by marriage. I showed them the SEC filing. I showed them the money trail. I did not apologize for the family drama. I framed it as a testament to my unyielding professional integrity. I told them that if I was willing to completely dismantle my own brother-in-law for attempting to defraud my firm, they could rest assured I would protect Sterling Global's assets with the exact same merciless precision. I watched their expressions shift from skeptical concern to absolute silent respect. The chairman of the board actually smiled. The crisis was averted. The $30 million contract was secured. I ended the call feeling a surge of pure, unfiltered adrenaline. Before I could even close my laptop, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open. Sarah stood panting in the doorway, her usual immaculate composure completely shattered. "Cassidy, we have a massive security breach in the main lobby," Sarah said, her voice strained. "Your mother and sister just bypassed the lower security desk by tailgating a delivery courier. They are upstairs. They are screaming at the reception staff and refusing to leave." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt. "What exactly are they demanding, Sarah?" Sarah swallowed hard. "They are demanding to speak to your manager. Your mother keeps telling the receptionist that you are a low-level consultant having a psychiatric breakdown, and she needs to speak to the boss of the company to get you formally terminated before you damage their reputation." A cold, dark humor settled in my chest. Catherine and Melanie had spent their entire lives underestimating me. They truly believed I was a struggling employee in a cubicle subject to the whims of some imaginary corporate superior. They thought they could waltz into a high-rise in downtown Chicago, throw a wealthy suburban tantrum, and have me discarded like trash. "Call building security," I instructed Gallagher, who was already reaching for his phone. "Have them meet me at the front desk." I walked out of the boardroom and down the long glass-walled corridor toward the main reception area. Long before I saw them, I could hear Catherine's shrill voice echoing off the marble floors. "I do not care if she is in a meeting," Catherine was yelling at my terrified lead receptionist. "You will pull her out right now. And I want the contact information for your human resources director and the president of this firm. My daughter is a severe liability to your operations. She is mentally unstable and currently under investigation for harassing my son-in-law." Melanie stood right beside her, her arms crossed, nodding emphatically. "She needs to be institutionalized," Melanie chimed in, projecting her voice so the entire floor of analysts could hear. "We are trying to protect your company from her delusions. Just bring us the man in charge." I stepped into the expansive lobby, flanked immediately by 3 towering security guards in dark suits. The reception area fell dead silent. The analysts who had been peering over their monitors quickly sat back down, pretending to work while watching the spectacle unfold. Catherine finally spotted me. Her eyes narrowed in vicious triumph. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "There she is. I want her packed up and escorted out of this building immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I walked slowly toward them, the click of my heels echoing sharply in the quiet room. I stopped 10 feet away, letting the absolute silence stretch until the air felt thick enough to suffocate them. "You are looking for the person in charge, Mother?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal weight. "You want to speak to the boss?" Catherine lifted her chin arrogantly. "Yes, I want to speak to the chief executive. You are a danger to yourself and others, Cassidy. You are going to lose your little job today." I looked at Melanie, whose smug smile was slowly beginning to falter as she noticed the deferential way the massive security guards were standing behind me. Then I looked back at Catherine. I am the CEO. I said every word crisp and unyielding. I am the founder. I own this firm, and you are trespassing. I watched the reality hit them. It was a physical blow. Catherine's mouth fell open in a silent, grotesque shape of absolute shock. The arrogant certainty drained out of her eyes, replaced by a frantic, scrambling panic as her brain desperately tried to process the fact that the daughter she had treated like dirt was actually a corporate titan holding her financial execution orders. Melanie visibly recoiled, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she realized she was not standing in front of a vulnerable sibling. She was standing in the epicenter of my empire. "Remove them," I commanded the security team, not breaking eye contact with my mother. "If they resist, have them arrested." The guards moved in immediately, gripping Catherine and Melanie by their arms. For a second, neither woman could even fight back. They were too paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their own miscalculation. As the guards dragged them toward the glass elevators, Melanie finally found her voice, screeching my name in a hysterical pitch, begging me to listen, begging for a minute to explain. I simply turned my back on them, letting the sound of the elevator doors sliding shut cut off their frantic cries. I walked back towards the executive corridor, my pulse steady, my mind completely clear. The heavy weight of childhood ghosts had just been severed and left on the lobby floor. Gallagher was waiting for me near the entrance to my office. He was holding a thick, legally binding document secured in a blue backing folder. He did not look at the elevators. He kept his eyes strictly on the business at hand. "The 48-hour default window for Terrence is up," Gallagher stated, handing me the heavy file. "We have received no wire transfers. Their accounts are completely empty. Do we seize the family estate?" I looked down at the documents. The deed to the house where I had spent years being pushed aside, minimized and emotionally starved, was now just a piece of paper waiting for my signature. I picked up a silver pen from my desk. I smiled. Execute it. By Sunday morning, the execution was fully underway. Catherine Vanguard had always treated Sundays as her personal coronation. For decades, the sprawling gardens of the family estate in the affluent northern suburbs had served as the ultimate stage for her elite social performances. This particular Sunday brunch was designed to be a masterclass in denial. Less than 48 hours after Terrence had been escorted out of his own gala by federal agents, Catherine had summoned the wealthiest, most influential women in her country club circle to the estate. She needed to control the damage. She needed to look these women in the eye and project an illusion of untouchable generational wealth. The caterers had been setting up since dawn. A lavish buffet of imported cheeses, smoked salmon, and artisanal pastries stretched across the manicured terrace. A harpist played softly near the rose garden. Catherine floated through the crowd of silk-clad socialites, a crystal flute of vintage mimosa in her hand. She wore a pristine ivory linen dress, her face a rigid mask of serene confidence. "It is merely a minor regulatory misunderstanding," Catherine announced loudly to a group of bank executives' wives, her voice dripping with bored dismissal. "You know how aggressively the SEC pursues brilliant tech innovators these days. Terrence's legal team will have the entire matter dismissed by Tuesday. It is barely a blip on our radar." The women nodded, sipping their drinks, their eyes darting around the manicured lawns and evaluating sweeps. They were vultures disguised as friends, waiting to see if the Vanguard carcass was ready to be picked apart. A few feet away, Melanie was failing to uphold the family facade. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped down a flight of stairs. She was hovering near the mimosa station, clutching a glass so tightly her knuckles were white. The dark circles under her eyes could not be masked by premium concealer. Her husband was facing multiple felony charges of wire fraud. Her corporate credit cards had all simultaneously declined the previous afternoon, and her entire identity was dissolving in real time. Catherine glided over to her golden child, keeping her smile fixed for the audience while her eyes burned with toxic fury. "Stop looking like a widow at a funeral, Melanie," Catherine hissed through gritted teeth, her lips barely moving. "Stand up straight. You are a vanguard. We do not show weakness to these people." Drink your mimosa and go talk to the judge's wife about the upcoming charity regatta. Melanie shook her head, her voice trembling. Mom, Terrence's lawyers stopped returning my calls last night. The accounts are completely locked. I had to pay the caterers this morning with the emergency cash from the safe. What are we going to do? We are going to smile, Catherine commanded, her manicured fingers digging viciously into Melanie's arm. I have protected this family's standing for 30 years. I am not going to let a temporary cash flow issue ruin us. We own this estate outright. We are untouchable. Now smile. At that exact moment, the heavy wrought iron gates at the front of the driveway swung open. A man in a sharp, unremarkable gray suit walked briskly up the cobblestone path. He did not pause at the valet station. He ignored the hired security guards stationed by the fountain. He marched with the absolute unyielding purpose of a man executing a federal mandate. He carried a thick, heavy manila folder under his left arm. He bypassed the catering staff, stepped directly onto the sunlit terrace, and cut a straight line through the crowd of gossiping socialites. Catherine spotted him immediately. Her false smile vanished. The rigid posture of the wealthy matriarch snapped into aggressive defense. "Excuse me," Catherine snapped, stepping directly into his path, blocking him from the center of the party. "Who let you in here? This is a private invitation, only event. You need to leave my property this instant before I have you arrested for trespassing." The man did not flinch. He did not take a step back. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, then looked directly into Catherine's furious eyes. "Catherine Vanguard," he asked, his voice flat, carrying easily over the soft music of the harpist. "I am Mrs. Vanguard, yes," Catherine replied, her tone dripping with aristocratic venom. "And you are interrupting my brunch. Get out." The man simply reached out and dropped the heavy manila folder directly onto the silver tray of pastries resting on the table beside her. It hit the metal with a heavy, definitive thud. "You have been served," the process server stated clearly, his voice devoid of any emotion. The terrace went completely dead. The harpist stopped playing. 30 of Chicago's wealthiest women turned their heads, their conversations halting instantly. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Catherine stared at the thick brown envelope resting on the pastries as if it were a live explosive. Her chest heaved. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged in the harsh morning sunlight. Melanie, frantic and desperate to hide the humiliation from their elite guests, lunged forward. She snatched the heavy folder off the tray, trying to shove it behind her back. But the envelope was not sealed. As she grabbed it, the thick stack of legal documents slid out, the heavy bond paper fanning across her hands. Melanie's eyes darted down to the bold, capitalized black text printed across the cover page. Her breath hitched. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as she read the top line. She looked at the second line and her hands began to shake violently. "What is it?" Catherine demanded, her voice a sharp, panicked whisper. "Give it to me, Melanie. Hide it." Melanie could not hide it. The shock broke through years of conditioned obedience. She read the bold print aloud, her voice cracking and echoing across the silent, crowded terrace. "Notice of default and immediate foreclosure. Order of asset seizure." Melanie looked up, her face twisted in total betrayal. She stared at the plaintiff listed at the bottom of the page. "Mom, you said the house was paid off." Melanie cried out, her voice echoing with raw panic. "You promised me you paid off the second mortgage after Dad died. This says the estate is being seized by the holding company. We are being evicted." Catherine lunged for the papers, her pristine image completely shattered. She ripped the documents from Melanie's hands, her eyes scanning the legal text. The truth she had hidden for a decade was suddenly laid bare in front of her entire social circle. She had not paid off the mortgage. She had secretly leveraged the family estate to the absolute limit, using the massive lines of credit to fund her gambling trips, her designer wardrobes, and her desperate need to project infinite wealth. She had bled the foundation of the family dry, isolating my father when he tried to stop her, and now the bill had finally come due. "Who is doing this?" Catherine shrieked, her voice shrill and unhinged as she shook the papers at the process server. "Who authorized this seizure? I demand to know who bought my debt." The process server remained perfectly still. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a single thick matte black business card. He extended his hand, offering the card directly to my mother. The CEO of Phoenix Holding Group said to call this number if you have questions. The server said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing sentence. Catherine snatched the card from his fingers. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. She pulled her cell phone from her designer clutch, her perfectly manicured fingers punching the digits on the card with frantic, desperate rage. She pressed the phone to her ear, ready to unleash decades of aristocratic fury on whoever was destroying her life. The line connected. A sharp, distinct ringtone suddenly echoed across the silent terrace. It was not coming from the receiver in Catherine's hand. The sound cut through the morning air, clear, loud, and entirely unapologetic. Every head on the terrace turned toward the source of the noise. I stood in the grand arched doorway leading out from the main foyer, the morning sun casting a long shadow across the patio stones. I was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal gray tailored suit. I held my personal cell phone in my right hand, letting the screen illuminate as the custom ringtone continued to echo off the stone walls of the estate. I slowly lowered the ringing phone, tapped the screen to decline the call, and locked eyes with my mother. "Good morning, Catherine," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You are standing on my property. It is time to leave." Catherine stood frozen as the custom ringtone died out. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the flagstone patio, the screen cracking instantly. The 30 elite women surrounding her gasped in unison. They were witnessing the brutal public dismantling of the Vanguard matriarch. I stepped fully onto the terrace, closing the distance between us. "Hello, Mom. I believe you're calling me," I said, my voice slicing through the morning air. From the shadows of the French doors, Terence emerged. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. His usually immaculate hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He had clearly been hiding inside, avoiding the very guests his mother-in-law was trying to impress, to save face after his federal humiliation. He stomped onto the patio, his heavy frame shaking with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. "You're Phoenix Holding! You bought our debt!" Terence bellowed, pointing a thick, shaking finger at me. The murmurs among the country club socialites escalated into a frantic buzz. They were piecing the puzzle together right before my eyes. The struggling daughter, the one Catherine had just spent 20 minutes calling mentally unstable, had just seized the Vanguard throne. "Dad bought your debt," I corrected him, keeping my posture entirely relaxed as I faced his towering, aggressive stance. "He knew you were draining his accounts, so he funneled the remaining assets to buy your loans. He left the detonator to me." Catherine let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her manicured nails digging into her cheeks. Melanie, standing beside her, looked utterly lost, her gaze darting between her husband, her mother, and the foreclosure papers still resting on the pastry tray. "What are you talking about?" Terence snarled, taking a threatening step forward. My security guards, who had quietly followed me up the driveway, immediately stepped out from behind the stone pillars and flanked me. Terence stopped dead in his tracks, his bravado crumbling the moment he faced actual physical resistance. I looked directly at my mother, watching the blood drain from her already pale face until she looked practically translucent. "Dad knew exactly what you were doing, Catherine. He knew you were bleeding his primary accounts dry to fund your ridiculous gambling habits and your desperate need to look like royalty. He knew you were using the estate as collateral to cover Terence and Melanie's fraudulent lifestyle. When he tried to stop you 10 years ago, you isolated him. You told everyone his mind was failing. You locked him away in his own home and took the keys to the kingdom." Catherine shook her head frantically, glancing at her wealthy friends, who were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. "That is a lie," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I took care of him. I protected this family. I sacrificed everything to keep us afloat." "You protected your bank access!" I shot back, my voice turning to ice. "But Dad was not as senile as you wanted everyone to believe. Before you completely stripped his authority, he reached out to me. We spent months routing the capital through shell companies, so you would never see it on a balance sheet. He used that capital to quietly purchase every single one of your predatory loans through a proxy firm. He bought your debt, Catherine. He bought Terrence's fraudulent corporate notes. He bought the second and third mortgages you secretly took out on this exact estate to pay for Melanie's wedding and your country club dues. I pulled a pristine white envelope from my tailored suit jacket and tossed it onto the table next to the foreclosure notice. He built Phoenix Holding Group specifically to hold you accountable, I said, staring her down with absolute clarity. I just waited for you to finally default on the payments. It took you longer than I expected, but your greed always outweighs your math skills. Melanie began to sob uncontrollably, sinking into one of the wrought iron patio chairs. We have nothing, she wailed, burying her face in her hands. Terrence is going to federal prison and we do not even have a house. Terrence looked like he was going to vomit. He backed away, his eyes darting toward the driveway as if calculating how far he could run before the federal agents found him again. His entire corporate identity had been built on a lie, and the architect of his destruction was the woman he had openly mocked at every family dinner. The high society guests had heard enough. One by one, the wealthy women began gathering their designer purses and silently filtering out toward the valet station. No one offered Catherine a word of comfort. No one offered to help. They were abandoning a sinking ship, leaving the vanguards to drown in their own corruption. Catherine watched her entire social empire evaporate in a matter of seconds. The illusion she had spent 30 years cultivating was gone. She turned back to me, her face twisting into a mask of pure desperate rage. The refined socialite vanished, leaving only a cornered, vicious grifter. I am your mother. You cannot throw me out of my own house. Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing wildly across the empty terrace and bouncing off the stone walls. I gave you life. I raised you. You owe me everything. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no familial obligation. The woman screaming at me was just a stranger who had spent decades trying to break my spirit to elevate her own status. You raised a punching bag, I replied softly, ensuring she heard every single word over the sound of her own hysteria. You raised a scapegoat to make Melanie look better. You spent my entire life telling me I was a failure because I refused to play your toxic games. But you forgot one crucial detail about scapegoats, Mother. Eventually, they leave the pen. And sometimes they come back as wolves. Catherine lunged forward, her hands raised as if she intended to strike me. My security team intercepted her immediately, stepping between us and forcing her back. She thrashed against them, her sophisticated veneer completely replaced by the primal panic of losing control. Get your hands off me, she screamed, struggling against the guards. This is my home. You cannot take my home. I calmly lifted my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my jacket to expose my watch. The bright morning sun glinted off the polished silver dial. I tapped the glass face once. You have exactly 72 hours to vacate my property, or the sheriff will do it for you. I turned my back on her screams. I walked down the cobblestone path, leaving the shattered remnants of the Vanguard family behind me. The air had never tasted so clean. I slid into the back seat of my waiting town car, the heavy door shutting with a solid, satisfying thud that sealed away the frantic shouting still echoing from the terrace. I did not tell my driver to pull away immediately. Instead, I opened my briefcase, extracted my secure tablet, and logged into the Phoenix Holding Group executive portal. When my father had engineered the buyout of Catherine's debt, he had embedded ironclad clauses into the default terms. As of exactly 8 o'clock this morning, the holding company had seized total administrative control of the estate's physical assets. That included the multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art smart home security system my mother had installed just last year to impress her paranoid wealthy neighbors. I tapped the screen authorizing my master access. Within seconds, a high-definition grid of camera feeds illuminated my tablet. I had a crystal-clear audio-enabled view of every primary room in the house. I clicked on the feed for the grand foyer. Terrence had stormed inside, leaving the bewildered brunch guests stranded on the terrace. Melanie was right on his heels, her face blotchy and streaked with ruined mascara. Catherine trailed behind them, clutching the foreclosure notice against her chest, as if holding it tight enough might magically erase the ink. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, sealing the three of them inside the echoing foyer. The mask of high society perfection instantly dissolved. With the audience gone, the predators had nothing left to hunt but each other. "You stupid, greedy liability!" Terrence roared, his voice cracking with unchecked rage. He hurled his suit jacket across the marble floor. Melanie flinched, taking a step back against the sweeping staircase. "Excuse me. You are the one the SEC dragged out of a ballroom. You are the one who committed wire fraud." Terrence closed the distance between them, his face turning a dangerous, mottled purple. "I committed wire fraud to keep you drowning in designer labels." He spat his finger, jabbing violently toward her face. "Do you have any idea how much capital you burned through this quarter alone? $200,000 in Paris, $50,000 on those ridiculous landscaping upgrades you demanded to keep up with the judge's wife. I was bleeding cash to fund your psychotic shopping addiction, and when the venture capitalists demanded audits, I had to cook the books to hide your relentless spending. Do not you dare blame my lifestyle for your incompetence!" Melanie shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. "You told me you were a tech visionary. You told me Vanguard was going public and we would be billionaires. You are nothing but a glorified con artist who used my family's name to get country club investors." I watched the screen, my expression perfectly neutral. For my entire life, this couple had been the gold standard of the Vanguard family. At every Thanksgiving, every Christmas dinner, and every forced family vacation, Terrence and Melanie had presented a united, polished front of flawless superiority. They had bonded over their shared cruelty. I remembered a holiday dinner 5 years ago when I had just started my crisis management firm. I was working 80-hour weeks, exhausted and stressed. Terrence and Melanie had cornered me in the kitchen, swirling expensive scotch in their crystal glasses. They had looked at me with identical expressions of condescending pity. They told me my anxiety was toxic. They told me my relentless working habits were a mental illness that was draining the positive energy from the family. They recommended I seek psychiatric help for my obvious instability. Watching them now screaming at each other in the foyer of a seized mansion, the truth was glaringly obvious. They had never been superior. They had been entirely reliant on stolen money to glue their rotting marriage together. The toxicity they had constantly projected onto me had always been their own reflection. Without my father's stolen wealth to insulate them, the veneer collapsed, exposing the feral, deeply unstable reality of their dynamic. They were not a power couple. They were two parasites fighting over a dying host. Catherine finally found her voice, stepping between them with her hands raised. "Stop it. Both of you stop screaming. The maids can hear you. We have to figure out how to handle Cassidy. We need a lawyer. We need to contest this foreclosure." "There is no contesting this," Catherine Terrence barked, turning his vicious anger onto his mother-in-law. He stepped toward her, towering over her trembling frame. "Your brilliant discarded daughter holds the master paper. She has the SEC files. She has the offshore routing numbers. You leveraged this house to the hilt because you could not stop pretending you were old money. You ruined us. You handed her the execution order on a silver platter." "I did this for the family," Catherine shrieked, her pristine composure entirely shattered. "I kept our status alive. You were supposed to be the safety net, Terrence. You were supposed to cover the margins when your company went public." "There is no company," Terrence yelled, his voice echoing brutally. "The feds have my servers. The accounts are frozen. I am facing 10 to 20 years in federal prison, and I am not going down because your daughter could not stop buying imported Italian marble." He turned his back on them, marching toward the heavy coat closet near the front entrance. "Where are you going?" Melanie demanded, panic replacing the anger in her voice. "Terrence, where are you going?" "I am leaving," he snapped, pulling a heavy leather duffel bag from the top shelf. "I am getting out of this house before your sister sends the federal marshals to change the locks. You two are dead weight. You are on your own." Melanie grabbed his arm, sobbing hysterically. "You cannot just leave me here. We are married. We are supposed to be a team. What about the lawyers? What about the bail money?" Terrence ripped his arm away with violent force, sending Melanie stumbling back against the wall. "There is no bail money, Melanie. We are broke. I sat in the quiet luxury of my town car, watching the chaotic implosion on my tablet. Terrence was lying. I knew he was lying because I had spent the last 12 hours tracking every single digital footprint he had left over the past 3 years. When you conduct a forensic audit on a man facing federal wire fraud, you find all the hidden trapdoors. I minimized the security camera feed and opened the encrypted financial dossier my lead analyst had compiled. I scrolled down to page 47, highlighting a specific string of routing numbers. Terrence had been skimming investor capital for 18 months, siphoning small, untraceable percentages out of Vanguard's operational budget and routing them through a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. He had nearly $2 million sitting in an offshore account that the SEC had not yet frozen because it was registered under a false entity. He was not packing a bag to go to a cheap motel. He was packing a bag to flee the jurisdiction before his passport was flagged. I looked at the camera feed again. Melanie was sliding down the wall, weeping into her hands, while Catherine stood paralyzed by the front door. Terrence was aggressively shoving designer watches and a small wall safe into his duffel bag. I tapped the messaging app on my phone. I selected Melanie's contact name. She needed to know exactly who she had married. She needed to know that the man she had defended, the man she had used to belittle me for years, was currently preparing to leave her to face the federal fallout entirely alone. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, drafting a single precise sentence. Ask Terrence about the offshore account in the Caymans. He's been hiding money from you to flee the country. I pressed send. On the security feed, I watched Melanie's cell phone light up on the console table. She lifted her tear-stained face, crawled over, and picked up the device. I watched her read the screen. I watched her entire body go completely rigid. I watched through the high-definition security feed as Melanie slowly lowered the phone. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly white. She did not cry. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal seemed to instantly vaporize her tears, replacing her panic with a cold, terrifying clarity. Terrence was still aggressively stuffing items from the foyer safe into his leather duffel bag. He grabbed a velvet box containing his vintage Rolex collection and shoved it roughly into the side pocket, zipping it shut with a harsh metallic rip. "Cayman Islands," Melanie said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet the sensitive microphones picked it up perfectly. Terrence froze. His broad shoulders went completely rigid. He did not turn around immediately. He kept his back to her, his hands gripping the handles of his bag so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his tone dropping an octave into something dangerous and lethal. "You have $2 million sitting in an offshore account in the Caymans." Melanie repeated, her voice rising, shaking with a volatile mixture of disbelief and fury. "You are not going to a hotel to figure this out with your lawyers. You are running. You are fleeing the country and leaving me here to deal with the federal agents." Terrence slowly turned around. The polished, charismatic tech CEO facade he had worn for the entirety of their marriage completely vanished. He looked at his wife not with guilt or remorse, but with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed off the marble floors. "And what exactly did you expect me to do, Melanie?" he snarled, taking a menacing step toward her. "Did you think I was going to sacrifice my freedom so you could continue playing pretend at the country club? I am looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary because of the massive gaping hole your lifestyle blew into my operational budget." Melanie stood her ground, though her entire body was trembling. "We were a team. We built a brand together. You loved me." Terrence laughed again, a cruel, scraping sound. "I loved the Vanguard name. I loved the access it gave me. Before I met you, I was a struggling developer getting rejected by every major bank in the city. Your mother had the country club connections. Your father had the pristine credit lines. You were nothing but an over-pampered, financially illiterate entry ticket. I married you for the prestige, Melanie. I needed your family's capital to secure my early investors." He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "I was broke when I put that ring on your finger. I used your mother's arrogance against her, and I used your desperate need for a fairy tale wedding to get my hands on the Vanguard estate equity. You are not a partner, Melanie. You are a liability. And I am cutting my losses. He grabbed his duffel bag, shoved past her with enough force to send her crashing into the mahogany console table and marched out the front door. The heavy wood slammed shut behind him, shaking the crystal chandelier hanging above the foyer. Melanie slid to the floor, her breathing shallow and frantic. The golden marriage, the pristine image she had used to mock and belittle me for my entire adult life, had just been exposed as a calculated predatory transaction. She had been used. She had been played by a man who saw her exactly as she was, an empty, superficial pawn. Mom, Melanie gasped, scrambling to her feet. She looked wildly around the empty foyer. Mom. I tapped my tablet screen, switching the security feed from the foyer to the master suite on the second floor. Catherine was not looking for her daughter. Catherine was frantically tearing her custom walk-in closet apart. She had pulled a massive vintage Louis Vuitton steamer trunk from the top shelf and thrown it open onto the center island. She was not packing clothes. She was sweeping entire trays of diamonds, emeralds, and platinum jewelry directly into the trunk. Melanie burst through the bedroom doors, her chest heaving. Mom, Terrence left. He took the money. He has an offshore account, and he is fleeing the country. We have to call the police. We have to tell them he is running. Catherine did not even pause. She yanked a velvet drawer completely out of its housing and dumped a tangled pile of diamond tennis bracelets into her bag. What are you doing? Melanie cried, stepping forward and grabbing her mother's arm. Mom, stop packing. We have to call your lawyers. We have to fight Cassidy. We have to stop the foreclosure. Catherine violently ripped her arm out of Melanie's grasp. She spun around, her eyes wide and feral. There is no fighting this, you stupid girl. The house is gone. The accounts are frozen. Your deranged sister managed to buy every single debt we hold. The empire is dead. Where are you going? Melanie asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whimper as she looked at the single heavy trunk. I have a contact in Monaco, Catherine snapped, zipping the trunk closed and snapping the brass locks into place. He owes me a favor. He can get me a private charter out of O'Hare in 2 hours before the banks realize my personal assets are missing. What about me? Melanie asked, tears streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. You cannot leave me here. Terrence is gone. The feds are going to come back looking for him. I have no money. My credit cards are declining. Catherine gripped the handle of her trunk. She looked at her golden child, the daughter she had elevated and praised for decades, and her expression turned to absolute ice. You are the legal wife of a federal fugitive, Melanie. You are under federal investigation by association. If I take you with me, they will track my movements and seize my jewelry. You brought that common thief into this family. You married a fraud because you were too lazy to do a background check on his finances. This is your mess. You clean it up. Catherine brushed past her weeping daughter, hauling the heavy trunk toward the private back staircase. Melanie fell to her knees in the center of the demolished closet, burying her face in the thick carpet, her wails echoing through the empty mansion. I locked my tablet and set it on the leather seat beside me. The rats had entirely consumed each other. There was nothing left to watch. Tell the driver to take me home, I instructed my security chief through the glass partition. 8 hours later, a massive thunderstorm rolled off Lake Michigan, hammering downtown Chicago with torrential rain and violent strikes of lightning. I was sitting in the quiet expanse of my penthouse living room, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, watching the city lights blur through the rain-lashed floor-to-ceiling windows. The private security buzzer on my wall chimed sharply. I walked over to the console and pressed the intercom button. Yes. Ms. Vanguard, the night concierge, said, his voice hesitant. I apologize for the late interruption. There is a woman down here demanding to see you. She bypasses all entry protocols. She is completely soaked and highly distressed. She claims she is your sister. Send her up, I replied smoothly. I walked to the private elevator doors that opened directly into my foyer. The heavy gears hummed as the car ascended the 50 floors. The brass doors slid open with a soft chime. Melanie stood in the elevator car. She was shivering uncontrollably. Her expensive silk dress was plastered to her skin, ruined by the freezing rain. She had no coat, no purse, and no shoes. Her bare feet left wet, muddy footprints on the polished marble floor of the elevator. Her face was a tragic canvas of smeared mascara and raw, unchecked devastation. The arrogant, pristine golden child had been completely erased. She stepped slowly out of the elevator, wrapping her arms tightly around her trembling shoulders. She looked at the expansive modern luxury of my penthouse, then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. "You were right," Melanie whispered, her voice cracking as fresh tears mixed with the rainwater dripping from her chin. "They betrayed me. They left me with absolutely nothing." She took a hesitant, shaking step forward, dropping to her knees on the cold marble of my foyer. "Please, Cassidy," she begged, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. "Please let me stay here." I looked down at the woman weeping on my marble floor. For 32 years, Melanie had been the golden child, a creature of pure entitlement, who viewed my existence as an unfortunate stain on her perfect life. Now stripped of her designer armor and her husband's stolen money, she expected me to simply erase decades of psychological torment because she was wet and cold. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. I retreated past the threshold of my private foyer, stepping out of the elevator vestibule and into the actual penthouse. I gripped the brass handles of my reinforced inner double doors and pulled them shut. The heavy wood slammed with a resounding thud. I engaged the primary deadbolt. Then, sliding the thick steel chain lock into its brass track, I opened the right door just 4 inches. The chain pulled taut with a sharp metallic clink. Melanie gasped, scrambling up from the floor. She rushed to the narrow gap, her wet hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Cassidy, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice echoing wildly in the sterile elevator vestibule. "Open the door! I am freezing! I have nowhere else to go! The storm is getting worse." "That sounds like a logistics issue." "Melanie," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. "Not a sister issue." Melanie pressed her face closer to the gap. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, muddy rivers, staining her pale skin. She shifted instantly into her practiced victim routine, the exact same performance that had worked on our mother for decades. "I am sorry," she sobbed, clutching the doorframe as if it were a life raft. "I was blind. Terrence manipulated me. Mom used me. I did not know they were stealing from Dad. I did not know they were trying to destroy you. You have to believe me. We are blood. We are sisters, Cassidy. We have to stick together." "Sisters," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue. It tasted like ash. "You did not call me your sister when you were laughing at my clothes during Thanksgiving dinners. You did not call me your sister when you and Terrence cornered me in the kitchen to mock my business plan. You only remembered we shared DNA the exact second your credit cards declined and your husband skipped town with his offshore accounts." "But I am apologizing," Melanie wailed, her voice pitching into a hysterical, grating frequency. "I am standing here begging you. I have no money. I have no coat. I am terrified. Please, Cassidy. You are the strong one. You have always been the strong one. Just let me in for one night. Let me sleep on your couch. I will do whatever you want. I will clean. I will cook. Just do not leave me out here." I stared at her wet, pleading eyes through the narrow crack in the door. I remembered a very different Melanie, a Melanie who held all the cards and wielded her power with absolute casual cruelty. "Do you remember when I was 19?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm. Melanie blinked, confused by the sudden sharp pivot in the conversation. What she stammered, shivering violently. "I was 19, I continued, enunciating every single syllable so they would ring clearly in her ears. "I had a severe kidney infection. I was discharged from Mercy Hospital at 2 in the morning. I had no money for a cab, my account was overdrawn, and my phone was dead. I used the hospital lobby phone to call you because Mom and Dad were in Europe. I begged you to come pick me up. I was running 103-degree fever, and I could barely stand on my own 2 feet." Melanie swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the vestibule. "Cassidy, we do not need to do this right now. Please." I did not stop. "You answered the phone. I told you I was scared. I told you I was in pain. You told me you had just gotten your new BMW detailed. You told me you did not want my sweaty, sick body messing up your pristine white leather interior. You told me to figure it out and then you hung up on me. I walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to get to a bus station. I ended up back in the emergency room 2 days later. I was young. Melanie cried, her voice taking on that familiar defensive whine. I was stupid and young, and Mom always told me you were exaggerating your illnesses for attention. You cannot hold something from 13 years ago against me when my entire life is falling apart today. It is not fair. I am not holding it against you, Melanie. I am simply recognizing the pattern. You only value people based on what they can do for you. When I was a sick teenager, I was a liability to your car interior. Now that I am the CEO of a holding company that just seized your estate, I am your savior. You do not want a sister. You want a shelter, and I am not opening my doors to a parasite. Melanie's face twisted in pure, unadulterated desperation. She tried to force her hand through the crack in the door, her manicured fingers clawing blindly, trying to unlatch the steel chain herself. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her nails scratching violently against the heavy oak. "I am a vanguard. You cannot leave me out here in the hallway like a stray dog. Mom abandoned me. Terrence abandoned me. You are all I have left." "That is the tragedy of burning every bridge you ever crossed, Melanie," I said, watching her frantic, useless struggle against the locked chain. "When the fire finally reaches you, there is absolutely no way out." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out my slim leather wallet and extracted a crisp, newly minted $100 bill. I folded it once down the middle, the green paper creasing sharply between my fingers. Melanie stopped scratching at the door. She watched the money in my hand. Her eyes widened, and a sudden, involuntary spark of greedy hope flashed through her tears. Even now, even at her absolute lowest standing, barefoot in a puddle of her own making, the sight of cash triggered her base instincts. I knelt down on the marble floor of my foyer. I slid the folded $100 bill under the heavy oak door, pushing it smoothly across the threshold until it rested perfectly on the wet tile right between Melanie's bare, muddy toes. "Here," I said, standing back up and looking her dead in the eye through the 4-inch gap. "Take an Uber. I am busy." Before she could scream, before she could utter a single word of protest or beg for another chance, I unhooked the chain, pulled the heavy oak door completely shut in the golden child's face, and drove the deadbolt home. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoing through my penthouse was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I turned my back on the front door, walked over to my wet bar, and poured myself a generous measure of bourbon. I took a slow sip, letting the amber liquid burn down my throat. The storm raged outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, washing away the last remnants of my sister's entitlement. I slept that night with the absolute undisturbed peace of a woman who had finally exterminated the parasites from her life. But desperate men rarely accept defeat with grace. By Tuesday afternoon, my legal department was on high alert. Gallagher walked into my office carrying a freshly printed legal brief, his expression grave. Terrence had not boarded a flight to the Cayman Islands. Instead of running, the cornered rat had decided to bare his teeth. "He filed an emergency injunction in probate court this morning," Gallagher said, dropping the thick file onto my desk. "He is alleging that you forged your father's signature on the master deed of assignment." He submitted sworn affidavits from 2 supposed handwriting experts claiming the transfer of the Phoenix Holding Group Trust was a sophisticated multi-million-dollar fraud orchestrated by you. I stared at the paperwork, a cold laugh escaping my lips. He is facing federal wire fraud charges, and his survival strategy is to accuse me of forgery. That is remarkably stupid, even for him. "It is a hostage tactic," Cassidy Gallagher warned, leaning his hands on my desk. "He knows the documents are fake. He knows he will eventually lose in court. But he also knows that contesting a blind trust of this magnitude will automatically trigger a judicial freeze on all contested assets. He is threatening to tie up the entire $70 million estate in probate hell for the next 5 to 10 years. He wants to drag you through a decade of exhausting, brutal litigation unless you agree to settle." I leaned back in my chair, tapping my silver pen against the leather blotter. "Let him try," I said smoothly. "Terrence is a man drowning in a riptide. He is just trying to pull me under with him." I worked late that evening finalizing the corporate restructuring for Sterling Global. By the time I packed up my briefcase, it was past 10 o'clock. The high-rise was completely deserted. The executive elevator deposited me into the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of the underground parking garage. The air down there was damp and carried the faint metallic scent of exhaust fumes. My heels clicked sharply against the concrete, the sound echoing off the massive cement pillars. I pressed the button on my key fob. The headlights of my black sedan flashed in the distance. As I approached the driver's side door, a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar directly behind my car. Terrence stepped into the harsh, flickering light of the overhead fluorescent bulbs. He looked nothing like the polished, arrogant venture capitalist who had mocked me at the funeral reception. His expensive trench coat was deeply wrinkled. He had not shaved in days, and his eyes were sunken, bloodshot, and wild with unchecked panic. He smelled strongly of stale liquor and desperation. "Hello, Cassidy," he rasped, moving to block my path to the car door. I stopped precisely 3 feet away from him. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the pepper spray in my bag. I simply looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying specimen under a microscope. "Step aside." "Terrence," I commanded, my voice echoing loudly in the empty garage. "You are trespassing on private corporate property." Terrence let out a harsh, jagged laugh. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled manila folder, slapping it violently against the hood of my car. "You think you are untouchable?" he snarled, taking a heavy step toward me. "You think you can just snap your fingers and erase my entire life? I built Vanguard from the ground up. I am not letting some bitter, jealous spinster tear down my empire." "You tore down your own empire the second you committed federal wire fraud," I replied coldly. "Move out of my way." He did not move. Instead, he used his massive physical frame to box me in, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. He slammed his hand against the window of my car, trapping me between his arm and the vehicle. He leaned down, hovering over me in an aggressive, predatory stance designed to trigger the scared, helpless girl I used to be. "I filed the injunction, Cassidy," he growled, spit flying from his lips. "I have expert witnesses lined up to testify that you manipulated a dying man and forged his signature to steal your mother's estate. I will drag your name through every tabloid in this city. I will make sure the board at Sterling Global knows they hired a criminal. I will bleed you dry with legal fees until you are begging for a truce." He tapped the manila folder on the hood. "Unless you sign this settlement agreement right now, you wire $5 million into an offshore routing account of my choosing, and you release the SEC holds on my domestic assets. You sign this, and I drop the injunction. You get to keep the rest of the estate, and I walk away. If you refuse, I swear to God, I will burn your entire life to the absolute ground." I stared up into his bloodshot, frantic eyes. I did not shrink away from his towering frame. I did not reach for the pen he was shoving toward my face. I maintained a smile so icy it could have frozen the damp air in the garage. "You are negotiating with a ghost, Terrence," I said smoothly. "You have absolutely no leverage." His face twisted into a mask of pure, violent rage. He raised his hand, balling his fist as if he were actually going to strike me right there in the parking structure. "You arrogant little coward!" Footsteps echoed sharply from the elevator bay behind him. Heavy, synchronized, and deliberate. Terrence froze, his fists suspended in midair. He slowly turned his head. Uncle Mitchell stepped out of the shadows of the concrete pillars. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were 2 massive men wearing tactical vests and silver badges clipped to their belts. They were off-duty police officers handpicked by my private security chief. "I wouldn't do that," Terrence Mitchell said, his deep voice carrying a lethal, unwavering authority. "We already handed your forged documents to the district attorney. What do you think happens next when the golden child tries one final move?" Terrence's face drained of all color, transforming from a dangerous crimson to a sickly, absolute white. His hand, still raised in a fist, began to shake uncontrollably before dropping limply to his side. The 2 off-duty officers stepped forward, moving with practiced, silent efficiency. One of them firmly grabbed Terence by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the concrete pillar. The metallic ratcheting sound of handcuffs echoing in the damp garage was profoundly musical. Mitchell calmly reached down and picked up the dropped manila folder from the hood of my car. He flipped through the forged documents, shaking his head in mild disgust. "Wire fraud, extortion, and now forgery," Mitchell said, his voice echoing coldly. "You really do not know when to stop digging, Terence." I did not offer Terence a parting glance. I simply pressed the unlock button on my key fob, pulled open my car door, and slid into the driver's seat. As I drove up the concrete ramp and out into the stormy Chicago night, the chapter of Terence and Melanie was permanently closed. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the digital countdown clock on my executive dashboard showed exactly 24 hours remaining until the holding company legally evicted Catherine from the Vanguard estate. I was reviewing the final liquidation schedules when my personal cell phone lit up with a text message. It was from Catherine. "Meet me at Le Petit Palais at noon. We need to settle this." The choice of venue was a desperate, highly calculated tactical maneuver. Le Petit Palais was the crown jewel of the city's high society, an ultra-exclusive French restaurant where the tables were spaced far apart and the city's elite gathered to observe one another. A raised voice or a public argument there was considered social suicide. Catherine was banking on my sense of decorum. She believed she could trap me in a public space, weaponize maternal guilt, and force me into a quiet, compliant settlement just to avoid causing a scene. I texted back a single word of confirmation. When I arrived at exactly noon, the maitre d' escorted me to a secluded corner booth. Catherine was already seated. She wore a flawless pearl gray Chanel suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, a glass of sparkling water resting near her manicured hand. But the harsh daylight streaming through the window exposed the deep, exhausted lines around her eyes. The mask of the untouchable matriarch was cracking under the immense pressure of her impending ruin. "Cassidy." Catherine said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet manufactured warmth as I slid into the booth opposite her. "Thank you for coming. I ordered the scallops for us to share." "Cancel them," I instructed the waiter who had materialized beside the table. "Bring me a black coffee, and then leave us entirely alone." The waiter nodded and vanished. Catherine's smile tightened, her jaw clenching slightly. "We need to stop this madness, Cassidy." She began, leaning forward and lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "People in our circle are starting to talk. The rumors are becoming unbearable. You have made your point. You have proven you are a shrewd businesswoman. But tomorrow morning, federal marshals are scheduled to throw your own mother out onto the street. You cannot let that happen. We are blood. I gave you life." "You gave me a genetic sequence, Catherine," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely void of emotion. "You gave Melanie a life. You gave me a series of expectations I was supposed to fail." Catherine sighed, a dramatic, long-suffering exhalation designed to project immense patience. "You have always misunderstood my parenting. I was tough on you because I knew you needed it. I was trying to prepare you for the real world. You were always so sensitive, so attached to your father and his ridiculous ideals." "Do not talk about my father," I warned, my tone dropping to a sharp glacial edge. But Catherine was desperate, and desperation makes people reckless. She plowed forward, attempting to rewrite history right in front of my eyes. "Someone has to tell you the truth," she insisted, her voice gaining a hard, defensive edge. "You put him on a pedestal, but your father was crazy, Cassidy. He was weak. His business practices were archaic, and he was driving the Vanguard name straight into the ground. I was just trying to keep this family afloat. I made the hard choices. I secured the credit lines. I protected our assets when his mind started going. I did what had to be done to save us." I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated narcissism required to tell that lie was breathtaking. She actually believed her own manufactured reality. She believed she could simply talk over the past and erase her crimes. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I placed it gently on the center of the pristine white tablecloth, right between her glass of sparkling water and the silver salt shaker. I unlocked the screen, opened a secure audio file, and maximized the volume. "You did not protect our assets, Catherine," I said softly. "You liquidated them to fund your country club vanity projects, and you did not save him." I pressed play. The audio was stark and crystal clear, free of any background noise. It was the sound of a man struggling to draw breath. Then my father's voice filled the quiet space of our corner booth. It was raspy, weak, and heartbreakingly fragile, recorded just days before his heart finally gave out. "Cassidy, if you are listening to this, I am already gone." The voice echoed from the phone. "You have to secure your own future. Do not trust your mother. She drained the primary operational accounts last month. She took out a secondary mortgage on the estate and routed the funds to a private trust in her name. When the doctors told me about the experimental valve procedure, I asked her for the money. She told me we could not afford it. She told me my life insurance payout was a better return on investment than my survival. She drove me to this bed, Cassidy. Her greed killed me. Do not let her do the same to you." I pressed pause. The silence at the table was absolute and deafening. A few patrons at the neighboring tables glanced over, drawn by the sound of the recording, but Catherine did not notice them. She sat completely paralyzed. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly made-up face. Her eyes were wide, staring at the black rectangle of my phone as if it were a loaded weapon. The arrogant, untouchable socialite had finally been cornered by the ghost of the man she had destroyed. The meticulously crafted lie she had lived for over a decade had just been incinerated in less than 60 seconds. Catherine's lower lip began to tremble. Her flawless posture collapsed. She slumped forward, resting her elbows on the table and burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as genuine, uncalculated tears of absolute defeat spilled over her fingers and dripped onto the expensive linen tablecloth. The matriarch was broken. She raised her head, her face blotchy and ravaged, her eyes completely devoid of defiance. She looked at me not as a mother looking at a daughter, but as a defeated prisoner looking at her executioner. "What do you want from me?" she begged, her voice a hollow, broken whisper. "I have nothing left. You took the house. You took the accounts. What else could you possibly want?" I leaned slowly across the table, closing the distance between us until I was entirely in her space. I looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. "I want you to go to the club's annual gala tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a precise, lethal whisper. "I want you to stand up in front of the entire board of directors, in front of every single woman you have ever judged or belittled. And I want you to admit to everyone in your country club that you are completely, undeniably broke." Catherine choked on a sob, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly turned to liquid. "You cannot ask me to do that," she hissed, her voice trembling with a raw, primal panic. "They will crucify me. I am the president of the Heritage Committee. I have spent 30 years building my reputation in this city. If I say those words, I will be a complete pariah." "You are already a pariah." "Catherine," I replied, standing up from the booth and smoothing the front of my blazer. "You just have not made the formal announcement yet. You have exactly 1 hour before the spring charity luncheon begins. If you do not take the podium and tell them the truth, I will send this audio file to the district attorney, the local news outlets, and every single member of your mailing list. You can choose social humiliation, or you can choose a criminal trial for elder abuse and fraud." The clock is ticking. I did not wait for her answer. I turned and walked out of Le Petit Palais, leaving her to pay the bill with whatever credit limit she had left. The Oakmont Country Club was a fortress of old money and generational arrogance. I arrived 45 minutes later, taking a seat at a small table near the back of the grand ballroom. The room was a sea of pastel silk dresses, sparkling diamonds, and forced predatory smiles. These were women who measured human worth entirely by zip codes and offshore portfolios. For my entire life, Catherine had ruled this room like a tyrant, using her supposed wealth to crush anyone who dared step out of line. I remembered being 14, wearing a discount dress to the annual summer brunch, and watching my mother loudly apologize to her friends for my lack of refinement. Today, the bill for that arrogance was coming due. Right on time, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Catherine walked in. She looked like a woman marching to her own execution. Her posture, usually rigid and commanding, was slumped. Her face was chalky, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She bypassed her usual seat at the head table and walked directly toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom. The soft clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low hum of gossip died down as Catherine approached the microphone. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. A sharp, high-pitched squeal echoed through the speakers, making several women in the front row flinch. "Ladies," Catherine began. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again, the microphone amplifying her terror for 200 of the wealthiest women in Chicago to hear. "I ask the committee chair for a moment of your time today." A heavy, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Beatrice Sterling, the club's vice president and Catherine's longtime rival, leaned forward with a look of hungry anticipation. "For 3 decades I have stood before you representing the Vanguard family," Catherine said, her voice shaking violently. "I have hosted your galas. I have dictated the terms of our charity drives. I have presented myself as a pillar of financial and social stability." She paused. She looked out at the sea of faces. Then her eyes found mine at the back of the room. I gave her a single sharp nod. "It was all a lie," Catherine blurted out, a rogue tear cutting a wet path through her powdered foundation. "The Vanguard estate is gone. We are completely, undeniably bankrupt. My home is being foreclosed on by the bank tomorrow morning. I have no liquid assets. I have no investments. My late husband's money was squandered, and I am entirely destitute." The ballroom descended into an absolute, suffocating, dead silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating implosion. For a narcissist like Catherine, whose entire identity was built on superiority and perceived wealth, uttering those words was a fate worse than physical death. Then the whispers began. It started as a low hiss in the front row and rapidly spread across the ballroom like wildfire. Women leaned into each other, their eyes darting toward Catherine with unfiltered disgust. The carefully constructed mask of high society vanished, replaced by the vicious predatory instinct of the pack turning on a wounded member. "I knew it," Beatrice Sterling said loudly, not even bothering to lower her voice. "I told you her husband's business practices were failing. She has been wearing the same Cartier watch for 3 seasons." Catherine stepped away from the podium, her chest heaving as she began to hyperventilate. She reached her hand out toward her closest friend, Eleanor, who was seated at the nearest table. "Eleanor, please," Catherine whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "I just need a place to stay for a few days, just until I sort this out." Eleanor physically recoiled. She pulled her chair back, scraping the legs loudly against the hardwood floor, as if poverty were a highly contagious disease. "Do not involve me in this," Eleanor snapped coldly. "You have completely disgraced this club. You need to leave." The rejection was immediate, total, and utterly brutal. Catherine let out a pathetic, wounded sob. She covered her face with her hands and fled the stage, sprinting down the center aisle of the ballroom as 200 women watched her social execution with cold, calculating amusement. I followed her out the double doors, walking at a calm, measured pace. She burst through the main lobby and pushed her way out the heavy glass entry doors into the overcast afternoon. She was weeping hysterically, stumbling down the front steps toward the valet stand, desperately searching for an escape from the nightmare she had created for herself. But the nightmare was only escalating. As Catherine reached the edge of the circular driveway, the screech of heavy tires shattered the quiet country club atmosphere. 3 black, unmarked SUVs swerved violently into the valet lane, boxing in a silver Mercedes that was waiting at the curb. Terrence was standing by the driver's side door of the Mercedes, a heavy travel bag slung over his shoulder. He had clearly tried to intercept Catherine at the club to secure her offshore connections, but he was completely out of time. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed on the back swarmed the driveway. Terrence Vance, a lead agent, shouted, drawing his weapon and aiming it directly at my brother-in-law's chest. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Put your hands on the roof of the car. Terrence dropped his bag, his face twisting in absolute terror. He tried to take a step backward, but two agents moved with blinding speed, grabbing his arms and slamming him violently against the hood of the Mercedes. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply across the pavement. You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempting to flee federal jurisdiction, the agent stated, his voice echoing over the manicured lawns. The SEC investigation is officially concluded. Catherine stood paralyzed on the country club steps, watching in utter horror as her son-in-law was locked in cuffs and dragged toward the back of a federal vehicle. Catherine stood paralyzed on the country club steps, watching in utter horror as her son-in-law was locked in cuffs and dragged toward the back of a federal vehicle. The flashing red and blue lights of the government SUVs painted my mother's pale face in alternating strokes of panic and defeat. I did not stay to offer comfort. I simply turned and walked to my waiting town car, the sound of federal agents shouting orders fading behind the heavy tinted glass. My mother hired a desperate bottom-tier bankruptcy lawyer to stall the inevitable. She managed to drag my 72-hour warning into a mandatory 30-day statutory eviction process through sheer legal obstruction. I did not mind the delay. It gave the financial poison time to fully circulate through her system. For 30 days, Catherine and Melanie were trapped inside a seized mansion with frozen bank accounts, no cellular service, and the relentless glare of local news vans parked at the end of their driveway. They were forced to watch their social empire collapse from the inside of a gilded cage. Today was day 30, the absolute unmovable legal deadline. The morning air was sharp and biting as my driver turned onto the sweeping circular driveway of the estate. I was not alone. A white and green county sheriff cruiser followed closely behind my vehicle, its lights off, but its presence undeniable. Mr. Gallagher, my ruthless head of legal, sat beside me in the back seat holding the finalized court orders. I stepped out of the car, adjusting the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. Two uniformed deputies stepped out of their cruiser, nodding respectfully to me. We walked up the wide stone steps together. I did not knock. I placed my master key into the brass lock, turned it, and pushed the heavy oak doors wide open. The grand foyer of the estate looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Cardboard boxes were haphazardly stacked against the imported mahogany walls. The priceless Persian rugs were scuffed with dirty footprints and covered in discarded packing tape. The illusion of untouchable generational wealth had been violently stripped away, leaving only the hollow, echoing shell of a repossessed property. The grand chandelier above us was dark because the holding company had officially cut the non-essential utilities. Heavy dragging footsteps echoed from the top of the sweeping grand staircase. Catherine and Melanie emerged from the second-floor landing. They were not wearing their customary designer silk or holding crystal champagne flutes. They were both sweating, their faces flushed and exhausted, dragging massive black plastic trash bags down the carpeted steps. The bags were bulging with whatever clothes and shoes they had scrambled to pack in their final hours of panic. I stood in the center of the foyer and watched the heavy black plastic scrape against the stairs. The visual struck me with the force of a physical blow, instantly transporting me back in time. 15 years ago, I was 18 years old. I had just been accepted to a state college, and I made the mistake of asking my mother for a minor loan to cover my freshman textbooks. Instead of helping me, she handed me a single black garbage bag. She told me I was a financial burden, a disappointing liability who was draining resources away from her golden child. She gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my entire life into that trash bag and leave. I vividly remembered dragging that black plastic bag down this exact driveway in the freezing Chicago wind. I had been sobbing, completely terrified of the future, while Catherine stood on the porch sipping hot tea and Melanie laughed down at me from her bedroom window. They had discarded me like absolute refuse. Now, the universe had aligned the scales with breathtaking poetic precision. I was standing in the foyer of a house I legally owned, flanked by armed officers of the law, while the two women who had thrown me out were literally hauling their entire lives in garbage bags. Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She dropped her trash bag onto the marble floor. She looked at me, her eyes red swollen and completely devoid of their former arrogance. She looked past me to the sheriff and the deputies, realizing there was absolutely no way out. No more delays, no more country club favors. Her reign was over. Are you satisfied? Catherine spat, her voice a harsh, broken rasp. You brought armed guards to throw your own mother into the street. You are a monster. I am simply a property owner enforcing a court order. I replied, my voice perfectly level and entirely unbothered. You have exactly 15 minutes to remove your personal effects before the deputies lock the doors. Melanie did not argue. The fight had been completely drained out of her the moment Terrence was arrested. She wiped her nose with the back of her trembling hand and walked slowly toward the formal living room. Her eyes darted frantically around the space, searching for anything of value she could easily carry. Above the grand fireplace hung a massive, original oil painting. It was a beautiful impressionist landscape that my father had purchased during a trip to France, long before the financial ruin began. It was worth at least $80,000 on the private market. Melanie reached up, her fingers trembling violently as she gripped the ornate gold frame. She struggled to lift it off the heavy brass wall hooks. Please, Melanie begged, her voice cracking as she looked over her shoulder at me. Let me take this. Just this one piece. I walked slowly into the living room, stopping a few feet away from her. The deputies stood by the doorway, watching the exchange closely. I have nothing, Melanie sobbed, the tears flowing freely down her pale cheeks. My husband is in federal custody, facing decades in prison. The government froze all my accounts. I am moving into a cramped, miserable studio apartment, and I do not even have money for the security deposit. I cannot afford groceries. I cannot afford a lawyer. If I can just sell this painting, I can survive the next few months. Please, Cassidy, have some mercy. We are blood. I looked at her tear-stained face. I looked at the hands gripping the gold frame. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of the mercy she was begging for. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my digital tablet. I opened the master inventory ledger of the Phoenix Holding Group Trust. I scrolled through the meticulous, itemized list of every single physical asset my father had legally transferred to the holding company before his death to protect it from Catherine's gambling debts. I found the entry for the French landscape painting. I locked the tablet screen. I slipped it back into my pocket and looked directly into my sister's desperate, pleading eyes. Sorry. That belongs to the trust. Leave it. Melanie's fingers uncurled from the heavy gold frame. She let out a wretched, defeated sob and allowed the painting to drop back against the wall. The heavy thud echoed through the empty living room, a final punctuation mark on her shattered entitlement. She grabbed her black plastic trash bag, her head bowed in absolute humiliation, and walked out the front door. Catherine followed close behind her, not daring to look back. The sheriff deputies pulled the heavy oak doors shut. The brass lock clicked into place. The estate was finally purged. The weeks that followed played out like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of consequences. The justice system and financial ruin worked in tandem, systematically dismantling the false royalty of the Vanguard family. I received regular updates from Gallagher regarding the federal indictment. Terrence was immediately denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk due to his offshore routing attempts. The man who had worn bespoke Italian suits and sipped vintage champagne at charity galas was now wearing a faded, oversized orange jumpsuit in the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His aggressive alpha male posturing had completely vanished the moment he was placed in the general population. Without Melanie's family name to shield him or stolen capital to hire high-powered defense attorneys, he was assigned an overworked public defender. He spent his days sitting in a cramped concrete cell, awaiting a trial that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years for defrauding federal banks. The SEC seized whatever hidden pennies they could locate in his accounts. He was entirely erased from the Chicago business world, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Melanie's descent was arguably more poetic. The golden child who had spent her entire existence mocking my thrift store clothes and community college budget was brutally introduced to the reality of the working class. She could not secure a corporate job. She had no real skills, no references, and a surname that was currently toxic in the business sector. She was forced to sign a lease on a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. I knew this because she attempted to use my name as a guarantor on the lease, a request my legal team swiftly blocked. To pay her meager rent and avoid homelessness, the former socialite was forced to take a minimum wage job as a barista at a high-volume coffee chain downtown. The irony was exquisite. Women from her former country club circle frequented that exact coffee shop. Melanie had to stand behind a sticky counter wearing a stained green apron over cheap polyester shirts, forced to smile and steam oat milk lattes for the very women who had watched her mother's social execution at the charity luncheon. She had to endure their condescending whispers and pitying glances, every single shift scrubbing espresso machines and sweeping floors while suffocating under the weight of her own shattered ego. Then there was Catherine. Stripped of her mansion, her designer wardrobe, and her elite status, she had absolutely nowhere to go. Her former friends had blacklisted her. Her wealthy contacts blocked her number. She was entirely dependent on the meager remains of a depleted Social Security fund. She ended up in a sterile, low-tier retirement facility funded by the state. It was a depressing cinder-block building with peeling linoleum floors, harsh fluorescent lighting, and meals served on partitioned plastic trays. For a narcissist who had fed on luxury and exclusivity, being surrounded by discarded, forgotten people in a bleak institutional setting was a psychological prison worse than any federal cell. But Catherine was relentless in her delusion. She refused to accept that her reign was permanently over. She still believed she could manipulate the daughter she had emotionally starved for decades. I stood on the expansive stone balcony of the master suite. The same master suite Terrence had bragged about expanding just a few weeks prior. The estate was quiet, the evening air crisp and clean. Below me, the sprawling gardens were beginning to bloom, finally free of the toxic vanity that had poisoned this property for years. I held a glass of expensive red wine in one hand and my secure smartphone in the other. The screen lit up with an incoming voicemail notification. The caller ID was blocked, but I knew exactly who it was. I tapped the speaker icon, letting the audio play out into the cool night air. Cassidy. Catherine's voice trembled through the tiny speaker. It sounded raspy, fragile, and utterly desperate. Please pick up the phone. I am begging you. The food here is inedible. The nurses are incredibly rude. They treat me like a commoner. They do not know who I am. I cannot live like this. You have your father's entire fortune. You have the house. You proved your point. Please, Cassidy, just send me a monthly allowance, just enough to move me to a private assisted living community. I am your mother. You cannot just leave me here to rot in this filthy room. We can start over. I forgive you for the eviction. Just send a check. I listened to her desperate bargaining. She was still trying to frame the situation as a mutual disagreement. She was still offering her worthless forgiveness for a crime I never committed, all while begging for a handout. She had not learned a single thing. She was simply out of ammunition and trying to fire blanks. I looked out over the manicured lawns. The darkness of the estate was comforting, a blank canvas, waiting for me to paint an entirely new legacy. The voice on the phone was just a ghost, a pathetic echo of a nightmare I had finally woken up from. I lowered the phone. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I did not feel the lingering sting of childhood rejection. I felt the absolute, unshakable power of a woman who had bought her own freedom. I pressed the delete button without a second thought. The message vanished into the digital void, erasing Catherine Vanguard from my life forever. I took a slow sip of my wine and smiled at the silence. But as I stood there in the quiet luxury of the master suite, the silence began to shift. The air in the mansion felt heavy, thick with the lingering residue of 30 years of vanity, manipulation, and greed. I walked through the cavernous hallways, my footsteps echoing against the imported marble. I looked at the sweeping staircase where Melanie had dragged her garbage bags, and the formal dining room where my mother had belittled my existence over countless holiday dinners. I realized something profound. I had won the war, seized the castle, and evicted the tyrants. but I had absolutely no desire to live inside their toxic monument. Moving into the estate would mean sleeping inside the very architecture of my childhood trauma. It would mean keeping Catherine's shrine intact. The ultimate victory was not sitting on my mother's stolen throne. The ultimate victory was burning the throne room to the ground and salting the earth. The very next morning, I made a call to Chicago's premier commercial demolition and construction firm. I did not ask for a renovation. I asked for an eradication. A week later, I stood at the edge of the property line flanked by Gallagher and my security team, wearing a hard hat and a tailored suit. A fleet of massive yellow bulldozers and excavators idled on the manicured lawn. I gave the foreman a single nod. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, shaking the ground beneath my feet. I watched with pure, unfiltered satisfaction as the steel claws tore into the grand facade of the estate. The custom walk-in closet where Melanie had hoarded her designer bags was ripped open and crushed. The lavish terrace where Catherine had hosted her final disastrous brunch collapsed in a spectacular cloud of drywall and dust. The physical manifestation of their golden child empire was systematically reduced to a mountain of rubble. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. But I was not just destroying the past. I was building an empire for the future. Over the next 18 months, I poured millions of dollars from the Phoenix Holding Group Trust into the cleared acreage. The opulent, useless mansion was replaced by a sprawling state-of-the-art commercial campus of glass and sustainable steel. It featured high-tech conference rooms, private residential suites, legal clinics, and comprehensive training centers. I transformed the site of my greatest humiliation into the Vanguard Phoenix Incubator. It was a fully funded, highly secure shelter and business accelerator designed exclusively for women escaping financial abuse. I created a sanctuary where victims of domestic and familial financial control could find immediate safe housing, pro bono legal representation, and elite corporate training. I brought in top-tier analysts from my crisis management firm to teach these women how to rebuild their credit launch, their own businesses, and seize absolute control of their financial destinies. I built a fortress where broken women were forged into unstoppable corporate weapons, guaranteeing that no husband, no mother, and no toxic family member could ever hold them hostage again. The grand opening was a flawless triumph. The campus gleamed in the bright autumn sun, completely unrecognizable from the dark, oppressive estate of my youth. Hundreds of people gathered on the expansive front lawn, including local politicians, prominent business leaders, and the first cohort of women moving into the residential suites. The press coverage was overwhelmingly positive, burying any lingering whispers of Catherine's old country club rumors under a tidal wave of philanthropic praise. I stood on the sleek modern stage set up for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The air was crisp and the energy in the crowd was electric. Uncle Mitchell stood proudly by my side. He looked healthier and happier than he had in decades, having finally witnessed the vindication of his brother's legacy. He placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder, his eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute pride. "Your father is watching," Cassidy Mitchell whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he looked out at the thriving campus. "He is watching, and he is cheering you on. You took the worst thing that ever happened to this family and turned it into a lifeline." I smiled, placing my hand over his. "We did it, Mitchell. We brought it home." Mr. Gallagher stepped onto the stage, adjusting his pristine suit jacket. He carried a heavy, embossed leather folio. He walked up to the podium and handed the folio directly to me. Inside was the final notarized deed to the campus, officially securing the property under the permanent protection of the charitable trust. The legal transition was absolutely irreversible. Catherine could never challenge it. Terrence could never touch it. The toxic legacy of the Vanguard family was thoroughly, legally, and physically eradicated from the face of the earth. I took the deed, the heavy paper feeling like a shield I had spent my entire life forging. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the crowd. I saw the faces of the women moving into the facility. Women who had been told they were worthless women, who had been stripped of their resources and their dignity. I saw myself in every single one of them. I knew exactly what it felt like to be handed a garbage bag and told to disappear. Now I was handing them the keys to their own kingdoms. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the microphone amplify my voice across the immaculate new campus. They told me I was nothing, so I bought the ground they walked on. Family isn't blood, it's the people who don't bleed you dry. If you've ever had to take your power back from the people who were supposed to protect you, share your story in the comments. And hit subscribe, because sometimes karma needs a little push. The power of reclaiming your worth. One profound lesson from these narratives is that true self-worth is never defined by those who mistreat you, even your own family. Toxic relatives often use manipulation and exclusion to maintain control. Walking away from conditional love is not a failure. It is an act of profound courage. Real value comes from recognizing your own potential when others completely dismiss it. By establishing firm boundaries, you create the necessary space to build an authentic chosen family based on genuine mutual respect. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries to protect your peace from toxic relatives? Share your story in the comments below.